Tonight, we journey to a lonely limestone ridge in southeastern Anatolia, to a place where the wind moves over the grass like a whisper from another age, and where the stones themselves seem to remember a world that should not have been possible. Here, on a hill known today as Göbekli Tepe, the old story of civilization begins to tremble. For generations, we told ourselves a simple tale. First came farming, then came villages, then came towns, rulers, temples, writing, armies, and kings. It was a neat ladder rising upward from hunger to harvest, from harvest to surplus, from surplus to power, and from power to the sacred architecture of the ancient world. It was a tale that made sense. It was orderly. It was comforting. It placed human progress inside a chain of cause and consequence. But then, beneath the soil of a quiet hill, archaeologists uncovered something older than the pyramids of Egypt by nearly 6,000 years. Older than Stonehenge, older than the first cities of Sumer, older than the first cuneiform tablets pressed into wet clay beside the Euphrates. They uncovered towering pillars of carved limestone, arranged in great circles and ovals, decorated with foxes, snakes, scorpions, wild boars, vultures, and strange beings that seemed to stand somewhere between animal, ancestor, and God. These were not the crude scratchings of a people barely awake to the world. These were deliberate works of symbolic power. They were monumental. They were planned. They were carried out with astonishing discipline by people who had no metal tools, no pottery, no domesticated beasts of burden, no written language, and, according to the old model, no reason to build on such a scale. And so the question rises from the dust like heat above the plain. Who built the first temple before civilization? The answer, if there is one, leads us into a world almost impossible to imagine, a world before kings and palaces, before empires and taxes, before bronze swords glittered in the hands of soldiers, before scribes counted grain for temple estates, before the wide banks of the Euphrates were lined with cities and walls, before the first pharaoh looked over the Nile and dreamed of eternity. This was the world of the early Holocene, around 10,000 years before the birth of Christ. Ice ages had retreated. The climate was changing. The great cold that had gripped the earth was loosening its hand. Herds moved across open landscapes. Wild grasses ripened in the hills. Gazelle, aurochs, wild ass, and boar roamed the plains and uplands. Human groups followed seasonal rhythms, hunting, gathering, meeting, dispersing, remembering. These people were hunter-gatherers, but the phrase can deceive us. It can make them sound simple, as if their lives were only a desperate search for food. Yet the evidence beneath the soil tells another story. Lithic analysis reveals complex tool traditions. Radiocarbon dating places their achievements deep in the 10th millennium BC. Stratigraphic excavation shows that Göbekli Tepe was not a brief accident or a passing camp, but a place built, used, altered, and buried across long spans of time. The builders understood stone. They understood landscape. They understood cooperation. They understood symbol, ritual, and memory. They looked at the living creatures around them and carved them into limestone with a force that still speaks across 12,000 years. And perhaps they understood something else as well, something we have only begun to approach. For Göbekli Tepe does not sit in isolation from the human mind. It stands at the edge of one of the greatest transitions our species ever endured, the long movement from mobile life into settled communities, from seasonal gathering into cultivation, from small kin groups into larger societies, from the open world of the hunt into the enclosed world of fields, houses, obligations, and inherited places. Yet Göbekli Tepe seems to appear at the threshold, not as the product of civilization, but perhaps as one of the forces that helped call civilization into being. That is the great reversal. That is the paradigm breaker. What if the temple came first? What if people did not build monuments because they had already become settled farmers? What if they began to gather, labor, feast, and organize because the sacred demanded it? What if shared belief, not bread, was the first architecture of civilization? Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. No inscription tells us the names of the builders. No buried king lies beneath the central pillars with a crown upon his skull. No tablet explains which spirits were honored, which stories were recited, which songs were sung beneath the stars. We have only stone, bone, soil, tools, animal remains, and the careful work of archaeology. The pillars stand like silent beings. Many are T-shaped, with broad heads and narrow bodies. Some bear carved arms and hands folded toward the belly. They may represent people, ancestors, spirits, gods, or something beyond our categories. They do not speak plainly. They refuse the easy answer. They pull us closer, then leave us answerless, adrift to ponder. Imagine the hill at night. The sky is immense, unpolluted, alive with stars. Fires burn in shallow pits. The smell of roasted meat drifts through the cold air. People arrive from distant camps and valleys, carrying flint blades, skins, baskets, memory, and hunger. Voices echo against limestone. Children watch the elders. Hunters tell of gazelle migrations and dangerous beasts. Stoneworkers shape blocks from nearby bedrock. Hands bleed. Songs rise. Myths are spoken. The dead are remembered. And at the center stand the pillars. Not ruins, then, not archaeology, not a puzzle for future scholars, but living presences in a sacred enclosure. White limestone catching the firelight. Carved animals seeming to move in the shifting glow. A fox frozen in motion. A serpent sliding across stone. A vulture opening its wings in the realm between flesh and sky. Were these images warnings, totems, clan signs, guardians, spirits of the hunt, messengers of death, maps of the cosmos? Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. What we can say is that Göbekli Tepe forces humility upon us. It reminds us that ancient people were not unfinished versions of ourselves. They were our intellectual and philosophical equals, living in worlds of danger, beauty, memory, and meaning. They did not need cities to think deeply. They did not need writing to imagine eternity. They did not need kings to raise stones toward the heavens. They stood at the beginning of something vast, and perhaps, in their own way, they knew it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as we begin this journey into the deep past, post your location and your local time in the comments, because wherever you are tonight, whatever hour it is beneath your own sky, we are all gathering around the same ancient fire, staring into the darkness, asking what came first, civilization or the sacred dream that made civilization possible. The hill did not announce itself with thunder. It did not split open beneath the feet of a shepherd. It did not reveal a golden mask. a buried palace, or a chamber glittering with royal treasure. For most of modern memory, it was simply a rounded rise in the landscape, a swelling of earth and stone set among the dry fields north of the great Mesopotamian plains. A farmer might have seen only a nuisance there, hard limestone blocks near the surface, strange stone fragments catching the plow, the kind of place where the soil was thin, where work was difficult, where the past seemed to interfere with the ordinary business of planting and survival. Yet archaeology often begins this way, not with certainty, but with disturbance, not with a clean answer, but with an object out of place. Göbekli Tepe means Potbelly Hill, a name that captures the gentle bulge of the mound. From a distance, it does not look like one of the turning points in human history. It does not tower like a mountain fortress or shine like a marble temple. It lies low and quiet beneath the Anatolian sun, surrounded by a landscape of stone, scrub, and cereal fields. But beneath that rounded body of earth lay an artificial mound, a tell made not by nature alone, but by human hands, human decisions, and human generations. In 1963, a joint survey by archaeologists from Istanbul University and the University of Chicago passed across the region. They noted the hill. They saw flint scatters. They observed broken limestone slabs. They recognized that something ancient was present, but the interpretation was cautious, and perhaps too cautious. The stones were thought to belong to a medieval cemetery or to some later disturbance. The site was recorded, but its true age and scale remained hidden. This is one of the great lessons of archaeology. Evidence can be seen and still not understood. The landscape was speaking, but the language had not yet been learned. For decades, Göbekli Tepe remained, in scholarly terms, a footnote. The hill kept its secret under the weather, under the roots of grasses, under the steps of villagers, under the long passage of ordinary days. Children grew up near it. Farmers worked around it. Stones were moved, reused, broken, ignored. The ancient world waited patiently beneath the surface. Then, in the 1990s, the hill drew a different kind of attention. Klaus Schmidt, a German archaeologist with experience in prehistoric Anatolia, came to the region and looked again at what had been dismissed. He saw what others had not fully grasped. The flint was not scattered casually. The stone fragments were not random. The limestone slabs did not belong to some recent cemetery. They were prehistoric. They were shaped. They were monumental. Schmidt understood that the hill was not merely a site. It was a buried world. In 1994, he visited Göbekli Tepe, and from that moment, the mound began to change its identity. What had been an overlooked rise in the land became a focus of systematic excavation. Teams began to remove the soil carefully, layer by layer, in the slow grammar of stratigraphic excavation. Every deposit mattered. Every stone position mattered. Every flint blade, animal bone, fragment of sculpture, and soil layer held a place in the story. The first great surprise was not simply that there were stones. It was that the stones were arranged. Large limestone pillars stood in circular and oval enclosures. Some were set into walls. Others rose in pairs near the center of the spaces, facing one another like silent figures. The pillars were T-shaped, with broad tops and long vertical shafts. Some reached heights of more than 5 meters. Many weighed several tons. They had been quarried from the surrounding limestone plateau, shaped with stone tools, transported, raised, and incorporated into architecture of astonishing precision. The discovery was not an isolated monument left exposed in the open. It was a complex. Enclosure lay beside enclosure. Earlier phases sat beneath later ones. Some circles had been filled in with rubble, bones, tools, and earth. Then new structures were built nearby or above. The mound was not a single event. It was an accumulation of acts. It had a biography. The deeper the excavators went, the older the site became. Radiocarbon dating placed the earliest monumental phases in the pre-pottery Neolithic, around the 10th millennium BC. This was the shock. These stones did not belong to the age of cities. They did not belong to kings, bronze, writing, or plowed states. They belonged to a time when people in the region were still living through the great transformation from mobile foraging to settled village life. For many scholars, this was deeply unsettling. A temple before farming, monumental architecture before pottery, complex ritual before the machinery of the state. The old sequence began to buckle. At Göbekli Tepe, the soil was full of flint tools. There were blades, scrapers, projectile points, and debris from tool-making. These were not the tools of metalworkers or literate masons. They belonged to people whose technology rested on stone, bone, wood, sinew, and skill. Yet the results of their labor were anything but simple. Lithic analysis showed expertise. The carving of the pillars showed patience and vision. The planning of the enclosures showed memory, cooperation, and authority of some kind, whether religious, communal, seasonal, or ancestral. Still, the hill resisted easy naming. Was this a sanctuary, a gathering place, a settlement, a place of the dead, a theater of initiation, a location where scattered groups met to feast, exchange partners, renew alliances, and tell the old stories beneath the watching pillars? The answer remains unsettled. That uncertainty is not a weakness. It is the honest shape of the evidence. The first excavations revealed no grand palace, no storage rooms filled with tribute, no throne room where a single ruler commanded the labor of thousands. Instead, Göbekli Tepe offered a stranger vision. The labor seems to have emerged from communities capable of gathering around shared symbols and shared obligations. The stones suggest coordination, but not necessarily kingship. They suggest hierarchy, but perhaps temporary hierarchy. They suggest ritual specialists, but not yet priests in the later temple state sense. There is a temptation to imagine the moment of discovery as a clean explosion of understanding, but archaeology does not work that way. The hill yielded itself slowly. The trowel found one edge, then another. A stone face emerged. A carved animal appeared from the dust. A wall curved into view. A central pillar rose from the earth like a being waking from a long sleep. Each find expanded the mystery rather than reducing it. The first great wonder of Göbekli Tepe was not that it solved the beginning of civilization. It was that it made the beginning mysterious again. For centuries, scholars had searched the ancient Near East for the roots of cities, agriculture, writing, and state power. They looked to the river valleys, to the alluvial plains, to the places where irrigation and grain storage might explain the rise of complexity. But here, on a limestone ridge, far from the classic birthplaces of urban life, a different force seemed to rise into view. Gathering, memory, ritual, the need to carve meaning into the world. And so, the hill that had hidden giants became a challenge to every simple explanation. Its discovery was not merely the uncovering of architecture, it was the uncovering of a question that had been buried with the stones themselves. What kind of society builds a sacred landscape before it builds a city? The people who made Göbekli Tepe left no written answer. Their voices are gone, scattered into the dust of the plateau, yet their work remains, emerging from the mound, one trench, one layer, one carved surface at a time. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden, not because the past is empty, but because it is vast, and because even the most careful excavation can only open a narrow window into the lives of those who stood here when the world was young. The first lines of the buried architecture did not appear as complete monuments. They arrived in fragments: a curved wall, a block of limestone, a strange flat surface where the shape was too clean to be natural, a carved edge emerging from dust, an animal form, still faint, still half held by the earth. This is how the impossible begins in archaeology, not as revelation, but as patient exposure. At Göbekli Tepe, the trowel became an instrument of time. Each scrape removed a breath of the present. Each basket of soil carried away the silence of millennia. The excavators were not digging for treasure in the old romantic sense. They were reading a mound. They were following layers. They were searching for relationships between stones, walls, fills, bones, tools, hearths, surfaces, and collapse. The work was slow because the past is fragile, and once a layer is removed, it cannot be placed back into history. This is why stratigraphic excavation matters so deeply. The ancient builders did not leave a book, but they did leave sequence. One deposit lay above another. One wall cut into an earlier fill. One enclosure was buried and replaced by another. One phase of activity gave way to the next. In that order, in that vertical memory of soil, archaeologists found the only true grammar the site was willing to give. The great circular enclosures began to emerge as if they had been designed for drama. The walls curved around an open space, built from stone and lined with pillars. These outer pillars stood like members of an assembly, each set into the architecture, each watching inward. At the center rose two larger monoliths. They were not simply supports, they were presences. Their height, their placement, and their careful shaping gave the spaces a ceremonial gravity that even ruin could not erase. The enclosures were not identical. Some were larger, some smaller, some were better preserved. Some had suffered from ancient disturbance, later activity, erosion, or the long pressures of burial. But in the most famous examples, the pattern was unmistakable. A ring of stones, a pair at the center, a deliberate focus, a place made not merely to shelter bodies, but to direct attention. And then came the carvings. There are moments in archaeology when a surface changes everything. A stone can be measured, weighed, dated, and classified, but a carving carries the mind of its maker more directly. It is intention made visible. At Göbekli Tepe, animal figures appeared on the pillars with startling confidence. Foxes stretched across the limestone, snakes curled in rows, wild boars stood tense and powerful. Birds with long legs and heavy bodies occupied the surfaces of the stones. Scorpions waited in silence. Bulls, gazelles, and other creatures formed a symbolic bestiary of the early Neolithic world. These were not decorative afterthoughts. They were part of the architecture's language. Some animals were carved in low relief, raised from the surface with careful cutting around their forms. Others seemed to move across the pillars as though the stone were a threshold between the visible world and some deeper order of being. The skill required was considerable. The carvers had no bronze chisels, no iron picks, no steel blades. They worked with stone tools, hammer stones, flint, and endless patience. Yet they achieved sharp outlines, controlled surfaces, and compositions powerful enough to unsettle the modern eye. The central pillars added another layer of strangeness. Some bear carved arms along their sides, ending in hands placed near the front of the body. Belts and loincloth-like forms appear on certain examples. The T-shape itself may represent an abstract human body, the broad top suggesting a head, the shaft a torso. If so, the pillars are not just stones marked with animals. They are figures surrounded by animals. They are beings in the middle of a sacred theater. But who were these beings? Ancestors? Spirits? Mythic founders? Guardians of the dead? Gods without names? Images of powerful persons transformed into stone? The evidence does not answer. It invites. The eureka moment, then, was not a single shout from a trench. It was a growing realization that this hill had preserved a symbolic system of great age and great scale. Every season of excavation added weight to the astonishment. The site was not an accident. It was not the product of casual gathering. It was architecture with intention, built and rebuilt by people whose social imagination had reached far beyond survival. The quarry marks deepened the mystery. Around the limestone plateau, archaeologists found places where pillars had been extracted or partly worked. Some remained unfinished, still attached to the bedrock, like thoughts abandoned before becoming speech. These unfinished stones are precious because they show process. They reveal the first stage of monument making, the cutting of a pillar from living rock. They let us imagine teams of people striking, levering, smoothing, and shaping, coordinating effort with a shared understanding of what the stone was meant to become. This was labor as ritual, or ritual as labor. The line between the two may not have existed. To carve a pillar was not just to make an object. It may have been to awaken a being. To move it may have been to enact a myth. To raise it inside an enclosure may have been to place the world in order. Modern categories divide engineering, religion, art, politics, and community. The builders may have experienced these things as one act, woven together in the body, the stone, the feast, the chant, and the remembered story. The fills that covered the enclosures are equally important. These were not simply natural silts washing in after abandonment. Many enclosures were intentionally packed with debris. The fill contained limestone rubble, flint tools, animal bones, fragments of sculptures, and occupational material. This act of burial appears deliberate, and it may have taken enormous effort. To build such spaces was impressive. To bury them was almost as impressive. Why would a community conceal what it had labored to create? Perhaps the enclosures had life cycles. Perhaps each belonged to a generation, a ritual group, a lineage, or a remembered event. Perhaps burial was a sacred closing, a way of preserving power rather than destroying it. Perhaps old beings had to be covered before new ones could rise. Perhaps the burial protected the place from misuse. Perhaps it marked death, renewal, or transition in ways no modern mind can fully recover. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The bones speak in fragments, the stones speak in symbols, the soil speaks in sequence. Yet the human voices that once gave meaning to the whole are absent. We cannot hear the words spoken when a pillar was raised. We cannot know whether the crowd watched in awe, fear, grief, celebration, or all these things together. We cannot know whether drums sounded, whether bodies were painted, whether masks were worn, whether the dead were invoked beneath the open sky, but we can stand at the edge of the evidence and feel its force. The enclosures reveal a society capable of planning across time. The pillars reveal a mastery of material and image. The carvings reveal a symbolic world rich with danger and meaning. The burial reveals that endings mattered as much as beginnings. This is not the archaeology of crude first attempts. This is the archaeology of people already deep inside culture, thought, and ceremony. They did not stumble into monumentality. They chose it. They organized around it. They returned to it. They altered it. They covered it with earth and stone, as though sealing a memory inside the hill itself. And so, from trench to trench, Göbekli Tepe became not a simple discovery, but a disturbance in the modern imagination. The stones did not merely add a new chapter to prehistory. They forced a reconsideration of what prehistory was capable of containing. No king's name was found. No royal tomb confirmed an empire. No inscription declared the purpose. Only rings of limestone, central figures, animal spirits, flint tools, bones of hunted creatures, and a silence so deep it feels almost intentional. Archaeology gave the hill back to the world, but not as a solved riddle. It returned it as a question carved in stone, a question standing beneath the Anatolian sky, asking how far back human imagination truly reaches, and how much of the first sacred architecture still waits beneath the dust, unseen, unspoken, and answerless, adrift to ponder. Long before the trenches were opened and the stones were numbered, the hill already belonged to memory. Not the memory of libraries, not the memory of written kingdoms, not the memory preserved by scribes in clay or ink, but the older kind, the kind that clings to a place because people have walked around it for generations and sensed that something there was not ordinary. Göbekli Tepe rose from the land with a soft, rounded shape, but the people living near it knew the hill was full of stone. They knew that the plow sometimes struck hard surfaces beneath the soil. They knew that broken blocks appeared in the fields, too heavy, too shaped, too strange to be explained as simple bedrock. They may not have known the full age of the place, but they knew enough to treat it differently. Across the ancient landscapes of the world, such places often gather stories. A mound becomes the grave of giants. A stone circle becomes the work of spirits. A lonely hill becomes a place where saints, ancestors, demons, or forgotten peoples once stood. The names change, the ages change, the explanations change, but the instinct remains the same. Human beings look at unusual forms in the land and feel that the visible world is only the surface of something deeper. At Göbekli Tepe, the old stones were not simply ignored. In later times, parts of the hill seem to have carried local reverence. Small acts of remembrance took place on its summit. Stones were gathered, shifted, and reused. The people who lived nearby were not archaeologists, but they were not blind. They recognized the hill as marked, as set apart, as a place with weight. The irony is that their reverence may have helped protect the mystery. A place that is feared, honored, or avoided can survive in ways ordinary ground does not. A hill used casually for building stone might be emptied. A hill too sacred to destroy might keep its deepest secrets. The boundary between preservation and disturbance is never clean. People remove stones, leave offerings, dig graves, build walls, repair paths, and tell stories. Each generation touches the past without fully understanding the layer beneath its own feet. This is why folklore matters to archaeology, not because every legend is literally true, but because legends often orbit real concentrations of ancient material. A tale of giants may preserve the memory of megaliths. A story of cursed ground may mark an old burial area. A shrine on a hilltop may stand upon a place whose sanctity is far older than the religion that now claims it. The landscape remembers in fragments, and human communities translate those fragments into the language available to them. At Göbekli Tepe, no ancient myth survives to explain the carved animals. No song has come down to name the beings represented by the great T-shaped pillars. No spoken genealogy can bridge 12,000 years. Yet the very persistence of the hill as a noticeable, meaningful place suggests that the dead do not disappear as easily from the land as they do from speech. The limestone ridge belongs to a wider sacred geography. To the south and east stretch the lands that later traditions would imagine as cradles of beginnings. The upper reaches of Mesopotamia, the broad world of the Euphrates and Tigris, the regions where farming villages, cities, temples, and written law would eventually emerge. In the far distance of time, this region became associated with gardens, floods, first people, first cities, and divine command. These later stories are not direct memories of Göbekli Tepe. That would be too easy, too tempting, and far beyond what the evidence allows. But they remind us of something important. This was a landscape where human beings repeatedly imagined origins. The first farmers did not inherit an empty world. They moved through places already charged with meaning. Springs, ridges, caves, river crossings, hunting grounds, burial places, and high points on the horizon could all become nodes in a mental map. To the modern eye, a hill is a geological feature. To ancient communities, it could be a threshold, a place where sky, earth, animal, ancestor, and spirit met. The position of Göbekli Tepe seems carefully chosen. From the summit, the view opens across the surrounding country. The ridge commands the horizon. It is not hidden in a valley. It is not tucked away as a private sanctuary. It watches and is watched. Those approaching from the surrounding plains would have seen the rise long before reaching it. The journey itself may have mattered. The climb may have mattered. The first glimpse of carved stone above the hill may have carried emotional force. Sacred places often begin with movement. People leave their ordinary camps. They walk, they gather, they carry food, tools, stories, skins, pigments, ornaments, and the remains of the dead, or the memory of them. They arrive not as isolated individuals, but as members of groups bound by obligation. The path becomes part of the ritual. The distance gives the destination power. By the time the hill is reached, the mind has already changed. There may have been seasonal rhythms to these gatherings, the movement of animals, the ripening of wild cereals, the availability of water, the timing of hunts, the return of particular stars, the death of elders, the initiation of youths. All of these could have drawn people to the ridge. A sacred landscape is not merely a place where belief happens. It is a place where the calendar of life becomes visible. And yet, the hill's original name is lost. The builders did not call it Göbekli Tepe. They had their own words, their own sounds, their own categories. Perhaps the place was named for an animal, perhaps for a spirit, perhaps for a founding event, perhaps for a story of emergence from stone, sky, or earth. Perhaps its name was not spoken casually. Perhaps it was known only in ceremony, whispered by elders under starlight. That lost name is one of the deepest silences of the site. Names anchor meaning. They tell us what a people thought they were seeing. Without the name, we must approach through evidence alone, through radiocarbon dating, stratigraphic excavation, lithic analysis, faunal remains, architectural plans, and comparative study. These methods are powerful. They give us discipline. They prevent fantasy from replacing knowledge. But even at their best, they cannot fully restore the sound of a sacred word spoken 12,000 years ago. So the hill remains double. It is scientific and mysterious. It is mapped by total station and haunted by unanswered questions. It is measured in meters, phases, layers, and carbon samples. Yet it also belongs to that older human experience of wonder before a marked place. The archaeologist kneels with a brush. The villager pauses at the summit. The ancient pilgrim approaches with fear or joy. Each sees a different hill, and yet all three are drawn by the same power of place. This is the strange life of Göbekli Tepe. It was built by people whose names are gone. It was buried by hands we cannot identify. It was carried forward in the landscape as a swelling of earth filled with stones. It passed through eras of hunters, farmers, herders, villagers, empires, faiths, and modern states. The hill remained while languages rose and vanished. It remained while gods were born, worshipped, forgotten, and replaced. It remained while the great civilizations of the ancient world took shape far to the south, glittered for a time, and collapsed into ruin. And still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The legends of the place are not enough to solve it. The local memory is not enough to explain the first carvings. The stones cannot be made to confess by romance alone, but neither should we strip the hill of its atmosphere. Archaeology without imagination becomes inventory. Imagination without archaeology becomes mist. At Göbekli Tepe, both are needed, held in tension, each correcting the other. The hill asks to be studied with rigor and approached with awe, because somewhere beneath the later names, later footsteps, and later misunderstandings lies the first intention. A community gathered on a limestone height and made it sacred in stone. They placed beings there. They gave animals permanent bodies. They turned a ridge into a monument, and a monument into a memory. The original story is gone, but the place still speaks in silence. To understand the people of Göbekli Tepe, one must first strip away the illusion of emptiness. The world before farming was not a blank stage waiting for civilization to begin. It was crowded with knowledge. It was filled with paths, seasons, animal migrations, edible roots, dangerous plants, hidden water, stone sources, campsites, hunting grounds, burial places, and remembered stories tied to every fold of the land. The people who moved through this world were not wandering aimlessly. They lived inside a map more intimate than any drawn on parchment. They knew when the grasses ripened. They knew where gazelle gathered. They knew which flint fractured cleanly and which stone was useless. They knew the moods of weather, the calls of birds, the smell of rain on dry ground, the traces of animals in dust, the safe ways across ridges, and the places where a careless step might end a life. This was not a primitive existence in the sense often imagined. It was demanding, technical, social, and intellectual. Survival required attention of the highest order. A hunter who misread tracks went hungry. A gatherer who mistook one plant for another might poison a family. A group that misunderstood the season could arrive too late at a food source and face hunger in a landscape that did not forgive. The builders of Göbekli Tepe lived near the beginning of the pre-pottery Neolithic, a time when communities across parts of Southwest Asia were experimenting with new ways of living. Some groups remained highly mobile. Others returned repeatedly to favored places. Some occupied settlements for longer parts of the year. Others began to manage wild plants and animals in ways that would eventually become domestication. But the process was uneven. There was no single morning when humanity awoke and became agricultural. Instead, there were generations of small choices, seeds gathered and dropped near camp, wild cereals cut in greater quantities, storage methods improved, dogs moving beside hunters. Young animals watched, followed, perhaps tolerated near human groups, settlements used more often, houses repaired rather than abandoned, graves placed under floors, memory fastening people to place. Göbekli Tepe stands in this charged moment, when the old world of foragers had not vanished, and the new world of farmers had not fully arrived. The people who built there likely drew from a broad hunting and gathering economy. The animal bones recovered from the site speak of wild creatures, not herds penned and owned in the later village sense. Gazelle appear in large numbers, wild cattle, boar, fox, hare, birds, and other animals also belong to the picture. These remains are not just refuse. They are evidence of diet, seasonality, landscape use, and social gathering. Imagine the skill required to bring down an aurochs, the great wild cattle of the ancient world. These animals were larger, stronger, and more dangerous than modern domestic cattle. To hunt them required coordination, courage, and knowledge of terrain. Gazelle hunting required different skills, perhaps mass drives, ambush, timing, and group cooperation. Birds, small mammals, and gathered plants added to the seasonal variety. This was a flexible economy, one that depended on knowing many resources rather than relying on a single crop. The wild cereals of the region were especially important. Wheat and barley grew naturally across nearby landscapes. Before full domestication, people could harvest these stands with stone sickles, gather large quantities, process them with grinding stones, and perhaps store them for later use. The presence of grinding equipment at early sites in the region tells us that grain was already becoming a significant food source before formal agriculture transformed the world. But grain alone did not build Göbekli Tepe. People did, and to gather people, there must have been reason. A hunter-gatherer world is often imagined as small bands scattered across the land, too busy surviving to create monumental architecture. But this underestimates the power of seasonal aggregation. Many mobile societies gather at certain times and places when food is abundant or when ritual obligations demand assembly. These gatherings can be socially intense. Marriages are arranged, disputes are settled, alliances are renewed, stories are told, objects are exchanged. Young people meet future partners. Elders reinforce shared identity. In such moments, a scattered world becomes briefly dense. The hill may have drawn groups from different territories. People who spent much of the year apart could have met there under a shared symbolic order. The pillars may have stood as signs that different groups understood, even if each group carried its own traditions. The animals carved in stone may have represented dangerous powers, clan identities, mythic beings, hunting knowledge, or the structure of the cosmos itself. At Göbekli Tepe, food and ritual were likely intertwined. The remains of large-scale consumption suggest that feasting may have played an important role. Feasting is never only eating. It creates obligation. It displays generosity. It transforms labor into memory. It allows leaders, elders, ritual specialists, or ambitious families to gain influence without yet ruling as kings. A group that feeds others becomes important. A group that organizes a hunt, a ceremony, or the raising of a pillar becomes remembered. This is how social complexity can grow without cities, not from command alone, but from attraction, not from taxation, but from participation, not from the grain store, but from the gathering. And still, the question remains, why would people invest so much effort in stone when their lives demanded movement and flexibility? Perhaps because the world itself was changing. After the last ice age, landscapes were shifting. Forests expanded in some areas. Open steppe changed character. Animal ranges adjusted. Human groups adapted. The familiar rhythms inherited from ancestors may have become less predictable. In such periods, ritual can become more important, not less. When the world changes, people seek continuity. They gather at powerful places. They anchor memory in stone. They build permanence against uncertainty. Göbekli Tepe may have offered exactly that, a fixed point in a shifting world. The people who carved the pillars did not need fields in the later agricultural sense to imagine permanence. They may have been drawn to permanence precisely because their lives still involved movement. A monument can hold a group's identity while its members travel. It can remember the dead while the living follow herds. It can mark a center without requiring everyone to live there all year. That possibility changes the way we imagine early society. The builders were not failed farmers or incomplete villagers. They were successful foragers at the edge of transformation. They possessed rich symbolic systems, strong social networks, technical mastery of stone, and the ability to mobilize labor around shared meanings. Their world was not lesser than the world of later cities. It was different, and in some ways perhaps freer, more fluid, and more deeply woven into the living landscape. Yet this freedom carried its own tensions. As groups gathered more often, as feasts became larger, as labor became organized, as certain places acquired greater importance, new expectations may have formed. People who once moved lightly through the land began returning again and again to the same locations. Paths deepened, memories thickened, obligations accumulated. A sacred hill could become a center. A center could draw food. Food gathering could become management. Management could become cultivation. The first steps toward agriculture may not have been taken only because people were hungry. They may have been taken because people needed to feed the rituals that held them together. Here the old story bends. Civilization may not have begun with a farmer looking at a seed and calculating surplus. It may have begun with a community looking at a stone and remembering a promise. It may have begun when people came together for reasons of belief, death, identity, and awe, then slowly reshaped their economy to sustain those gatherings. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know the names of the groups who came to the hill. We do not know how far they traveled. We do not know whether they spoke one language or many. We do not know whether the carvings united them or marked differences between them. We do not know whether the builders thought of themselves as one people, many peoples, or something no modern category can hold, but the evidence lets us see enough to abandon the old contempt. These were not simple wanderers waiting for civilization to rescue them. They were makers of worlds. They carried in their minds the movements of animals, the cycles of plants, the memory of ancestors, the danger of predators, the promise of gathering, the power of place, and the possibility that stone could make the invisible endure. In the bright fields and dry uplands around Göbekli Tepe, before pottery, before writing, before the city, human beings were already asking questions that have never left us. Where do we come from? Who watches over the living? How should the dead be remembered? What binds one group to another? What must be built so that memory does not vanish? The first temple before civilization may have been built by hunter-gatherers, but it was not built by people without history. It was built by people whose history was carried in footsteps, scars, songs, tools, bones, and stone. It was built by those who lived close to the wild world and yet reached beyond it, into symbol, ceremony, and the long desire to leave a mark that outlived the hand that made it. Across the deep past, climate was never a background. It was an actor. It moved through human life like an unseen power, shaping the paths of animals, the growth of plants, the availability of water, the dangers of winter, the promise of spring, and the limits of what a community could imagine. Long before kings claimed the favor of heaven, long before priests read omens in smoke and stars, the sky itself governed the fortunes of humankind. The world of Göbekli Tepe emerged from one of the most dramatic environmental transitions our species has ever known. For tens of thousands of years, human beings had lived beneath the long shadow of the Ice Age. Great sheets of ice locked away water. Sea levels were lower. Winds carried dust across open country. Landscapes shifted between steppe, woodland, cold grassland, and refuge zones where life could gather in pockets of abundance. People adapted with extraordinary skill, following herds, exploiting seasonal plants, building shelters, making tools, painting caves, burying the dead, and telling stories beneath skies colder than our own. Then the earth began to warm. The glaciers retreated, forests spread, rivers changed their courses and their moods. Plants colonized new ground, animals moved into fresh ranges or vanished from old ones. The great map of survival, memorized across generations, began to alter. But the warming was not smooth. It came with violence, reversal, instability, and surprise. Among the most important episodes was the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to colder and drier conditions that began around the end of the last ice age and lasted for more than a millennium. In the eastern Mediterranean and Southwest Asia, its effects were complex, but its pressure was real. Rainfall patterns shifted, plant communities changed, the availability of wild cereals may have fluctuated, herd movements may have become less predictable. The human groups who had learned the rhythms of a warming world were forced to confront uncertainty once again. This matters because uncertainty changes societies. A stable world allows memory to function like a map. The elders know where to go because their elders knew before them. The same valleys provide the same stands of grain. The same hunting routes bring the same animals. The same springs flow in the expected season. But when climate becomes unstable, memory remains precious while also becoming incomplete. Old knowledge must be revised. Groups must communicate more widely. Alliances become more valuable. Gathering places become more important. In such a world, a sacred center is not an escape from survival. It is part of survival. The hill may have served as a place where scattered communities exchanged information about distant landscapes. Where have the gazelle gone? Which valleys still hold water? Which stands of wild grain have failed? Which groups are moving closer? Where has sickness touched the camps? Where can marriages be made? Conflicts softened, and hunting partners found. To modern minds, ritual and practical life are often separated, but ancient communities did not necessarily divide them so cleanly. A ceremony could also be a council. A feast could also be an exchange network. A sacred story could encode ecological knowledge. A carved animal could speak of danger, season, identity, or myth all at once. The climate did not build Göbekli Tepe by itself. Weather has no hands, but climate can create conditions in which human beings gather, cooperate, compete, and imagine in new ways. It can compress populations into favorable zones. It can make certain resources more attractive. It can turn reliable places into treasures. It can make the act of gathering both necessary and sacred. At the end of the Younger Dryas, warming returned with force. The early Holocene brought new possibilities across the region. Wild cereals flourished in certain zones. Herds moved across open country. Human groups found themselves living amid both abundance and memory of stress. That combination can be powerful. People who have endured scarcity may invest deeply in places and practices that seem to protect continuity. They may gather more often. They may store food more carefully. They may experiment with plants. They may create rituals of renewal, gratitude, fear, and control. Perhaps the stones of Göbekli Tepe belong partly to this emotional climate, not merely cold or warmth, not merely rainfall or drought, but the human experience of a changing earth. Imagine communities watching familiar landscapes transform across generations. A valley that once held open grass becomes dotted with trees. A spring weakens, then returns. A herd route shifts. A plant once gathered in one place appears more thickly in another. Children grow up hearing elders speak of seasons that no longer behave as they should. The world itself seems alive, uncertain, perhaps intentional. Under such conditions, the boundary between environment and spirit becomes thin. A storm is not only weather. A failed migration is not only animal movement. A drought is not only absence of rain. These events press upon the mind. They demand explanation. They invite story. They create the need for places where the community can address the forces that surround it. The carvings at Göbekli Tepe are full of animals, but not gentle animals alone. Snakes, boars, foxes, birds of prey, wild cattle, and scorpion all belong to a world where nature is not passive scenery. It bites, it charges, it poisons, it watches from the dark. It cleans the dead. It teaches caution. It inspires awe. The animal imagery may reflect a symbolic landscape in which human beings were negotiating their place among powers larger than themselves. In that sense, the climate story is also a story of humility. The builders did not rule nature. They lived inside it. Their monuments did not stand against the wild, as later city walls would stand against outsiders. Their stones seemed to draw the wild inward, to give it form, to surround the central beings with creatures of claw, fang, beak, hoof, and scale. The sacred was not separate from the animal world. It was saturated with it. This is one reason Göbekli Tepe feels so ancient in spirit. Later, civilizations often placed gods above nature, enthroned in temples, served by priests, fed by agricultural surplus, wrapped in political order. Here, the sacred world still feels close to the hunt, close to death, close to the skin of animals, close to the sudden movement in grass, the climate, the herds, the hills, and the stones all belong to one living system of meaning. Environmental archaeology helps make this world visible. Charred plant remains, pollen evidence from regional studies, animal bones, sediments, and climate records together create a larger frame. None of these speak as clearly as a written chronicle, but together they show a planet in transition and communities responding with invention. The people of the early Holocene were not passive victims of climate change. They were experimenters. They adjusted movement, diet, technology, settlement, and ritual. The great mistake is to imagine that necessity destroys imagination. Often it sharpens it. A changing world may have encouraged people to think on larger scales, to form wider networks, to return to powerful centers, to mark identity in stone, and to use ceremony as a way of holding society together when the landscape itself refused to remain still. The hill, then, may not have been only a monument of faith. It may have been a monument of adaptation, a fixed place in a restless world, a gathering point for communities learning to live with new climates, new resources, new pressures, and new possibilities. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The stones do not tell us whether a particular drought drove a particular gathering. The bones do not tell us whether one cold season was remembered as divine anger. The soil does not tell us whether songs were sung to call back animals, rain, warmth, or the spirits of the dead. Yet the pattern is suggestive. At the very moment when the earth was changing, human beings began to build with unprecedented ambition. At the very moment when the old Ice Age world faded, communities on a limestone ridge carved animals into pillars and raised silent figures beneath the sky. At the very moment when survival demanded flexibility, they created permanence. That is the paradox. Out of instability came stone. Out of shifting seasons came fixed centers. Out of a changing climate came one of the earliest monumental landscapes ever made by human hands. And perhaps that is not a contradiction at all. Perhaps permanence is most desired when the world feels uncertain. Perhaps sacred architecture begins where human beings stand before forces they cannot command and decide. Nevertheless, to answer with labor, gathering, memory, and form. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. But in the shadows of the Younger Dryas, in the dawn of the Holocene, Göbekli Tepe stands as a reminder that the first temples were not built outside nature. They were built within its turbulence, by people who felt the world changing around them and carved their response into stone. The pillars are the heart of the mystery. They rise from the stone floors and curved walls like beings rather than objects, shaped from limestone, but refusing to remain merely geological. They are not rough boulders dragged into place. They are worked, planned, smoothed, carved and positioned. Their form is strange in its simplicity, a long vertical body crowned by a broad horizontal head, making the now famous T shape that has become the signature of Göbekli Tepe. At first glance, they may seem abstract, but the longer one looks, the less abstract they become. Some carry arms carved down their sides, thin and deliberate, with hands reaching toward the front of the body. Some wear belts, and below the belts hang forms that resemble cloth, skins, or symbolic coverings. These details transform the pillars. They are no longer only standing stones. They become bodies without faces, presences without eyes, human-like figures reduced to essential form, as if the builders wished to show personhood without portraiture. This absence of faces is one of the most haunting features of the site. A face invites recognition. A face gives identity. A face fixes emotion. But these beings are faceless, and therefore larger than individuals. They may represent ancestors whose names were known in ceremony, but not carved in stone. They may represent spirits too powerful to be given human features. They may represent mythic beings whose identity lay not in eyes, nose, and mouth, but in posture, scale, and placement. They stand with a stillness that feels intentional, not seated, not walking, not hunting, standing, watching without eyes. The two central pillars in several enclosures dominate the space. Around them, smaller pillars line the walls, often bearing animals. This arrangement creates a powerful symbolic drama. The central figure seems surrounded by the living forces of the world. Foxes, snakes, boars, birds, and other creatures move across the surrounding stones, while the great anthropomorphic forms stand at the center like witnesses, rulers, ancestors, or guardians of a cosmic order. The animals are not random decoration. They are active participants in the architecture. The fox appears again and again, lean, clever, alert, moving between open land and hidden den. The fox is a creature of boundary and ambiguity. In many human cultures, animals like foxes become tricksters, messengers, shapeshifters, and beings of cunning. We cannot simply project later myths back onto the Neolithic, but the repeated presence of foxes at Göbekli Tepe suggests that the animal carried meaning beyond meat or fur. Snakes also occupy the stones with striking frequency. They slide across the pillars in groups or lines, sometimes seeming to pour downward like living streams. Snakes are among the most symbolically potent animals in human thought. They shed their skins. They vanish into holes. They appear suddenly and dangerously. They move without limbs, close to the earth, close to death, close to renewal. At Göbekli Tepe, their carved bodies may have evoked fear, transformation, the underworld, or the hidden life beneath the ground. The boar is different. It is force, it is muscle, tusk, aggression, and flesh. Wild boar are dangerous animals, capable of wounding hunters and dogs. To carve a boar is to carve a creature known through risk. The same may be said of wild cattle, whose enormous strength made them both prized and terrifying. Such animals remind us that the builders lived in intimate contact with danger. They did not encounter the wild as spectacle. They met it in hunger, blood, pursuit, and fear. Birds appear, too, including large forms often interpreted as vultures or cranes. These birds invite some of the deepest speculation because of their association, in many societies, with death, sky, and transformation. Vultures in particular consume the dead and rise into the air, making them powerful figures for thinking about the passage from flesh to spirit. At some early Neolithic sites, mortuary practices involved the handling, display, or secondary treatment of human remains. Within that wider world, birds at Göbekli Tepe may have touched on beliefs about death and the journey of the body. One famous pillar shows a complex scene with a large bird-like figure, a scorpion, and other signs, including a headless human form. Such imagery resists any single reading. It may represent a myth. It may represent a warning. It may compress multiple ideas into one surface. It may relate to death, danger, cosmic order, or initiation. It is tempting to call it a story carved in stone. But if so, the words of that story are lost. Still, the composition matters. The builders were not merely filling space. They selected images. They placed them in relation to one another. They used scale, position, and repetition. The pillars were not blank supports with occasional marks. They were surfaces of thought. To make these carvings required a deep understanding of the material. Limestone is workable, but it is not effortless. The carvers had to remove stone around the animal figures, leaving the bodies raised from the background. This demanded control, planning, and confidence. A mistake could ruin the surface. A broken snout, a slipped edge, a failed line could change the image permanently. The people who carved these animals had practiced. They had traditions of making. They had specialists, or at least individuals recognized for unusual skill. Their tools were stone, but their vision was not crude. Lithic analysis helps us understand the world behind the carvings. Flint blades, scrapers, burins, and other implements formed the toolkit of those who shaped, cut, butchered, prepared hides, worked wood, and perhaps finished the surfaces of the pillars. A stone tool is not a symbol of limitation. In expert hands, it is precise, sharp, and versatile. The builders of Göbekli Tepe did not lack intelligence because they lacked metal. Their achievements prove the opposite. The pillars also ask questions about the human body. Why show arms and hands but not faces? Why emphasize belts and lower garments? Why create beings whose heads are not rounded skulls but flat horizontal forms? The answer may lie in a symbolic convention now mostly lost. Perhaps the T-shape represented a body, as seen through ritual costume. Perhaps the broad head symbolized a headdress, mask, or spiritual form. Perhaps faces were painted, covered, or imagined rather than carved. Perhaps these were not ordinary bodies at all, but transformed bodies, beings of stone who existed beyond flesh. Paint may once have changed everything. Many ancient monuments now appear pale and austere because time has stripped them down to bone. Yet Neolithic people used pigments widely. If the pillars were once colored, the experience of standing among them would have been radically different. Red, black, white, and ochre tones may have animated surfaces. Animals may have seemed more vivid. Belts, hands, and bodies may have stood out in firelight. What appears silent and minimal today may once have been intense, bright, and theatrical. The sensory world of the enclosures is almost entirely lost. We see stone, but they may have seen color. We see ruin, but they may have seen completion. We see carved animals, but they may have heard songs naming them. We see faceless pillars, but they may have known exactly who stood before them. This gap is what makes Göbekli Tepe both scientifically rich and emotionally difficult. The evidence is strong enough to show complexity, but incomplete enough to deny certainty. Every animal carved into stone is both data and mystery. It can be recorded, photographed, compared, measured, and catalogued, yet its deepest meaning remains just beyond reach. The pillars may have been part of ceremonies involving the dead. They may have marked group identities. They may have represented a mythic assembly. They may have encoded relations between humans and animals. They may have stood as ancestors in a world where lineage, memory, and place were becoming newly important. Each interpretation finds some foothold, but none conquers the site completely, and perhaps no single explanation is enough. A sacred image can hold many meanings at once. A fox can be an animal, a spirit, a clan sign, a memory of a hunt, a trickster, a danger, and a guide. A snake can be death, earth, renewal, fear, and hidden knowledge. A central pillar can be ancestor, god, body, monument, and axis of the world. Modern analysis often seeks one definition. Ancient symbols often thrive by refusing one. The T-shaped watchers remain. They do not explain themselves. They stand in the mind long after the measurements are taken, long after the trench plans are drawn, long after the dust is brushed from the carved reliefs. They seem to belong to a moment when human beings first began to make the invisible large enough to gather around. Not small charms carried in a pouch, not marks hidden in caves, but towering forms in open architecture, beings that required a community to create and a community to confront. Here, stone became presence. Here, animals became signs. Here, the human form was stretched into abstraction and raised above the floor like a memory too important to perish. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The pillars keep their faces from us, perhaps because they never had faces, perhaps because the face was not the point. What mattered was standing. What mattered was enduring. What mattered was the transformation of limestone into a society of watchers, assembled on a hill at the dawn of settled life. And in their silence, they leave us answerless, adrift to ponder the first great gallery of human belief, carved not by kings or slaves, but by communities who looked upon the wild world, saw power everywhere, and gave that power a body of stone. To raise a pillar at Göbekli Tepe, imagination was not enough. A vision may begin in dream, myth, command, fear, or reverence, but stone answers only to labor. It must be found, cut, shaped, moved, lifted, balanced, and held in place. Every monument is therefore both symbol and engineering. It belongs as much to the hand as to the mind. The limestone around Göbekli Tepe offered the raw material. It lay in the ridge itself, close to the enclosures, exposed in slabs and beds that could be quarried with the tools of the time. This matters greatly. The builders did not drag megaliths from distant mountains across impossible terrain. They used the geology beneath their feet. The sacred landscape and the material landscape were one. The quarry areas reveal the beginning of the process. There, in the bedrock, one can imagine the outlines of pillars being marked out and separated from the living stone. Some unfinished examples remain, like abandoned bodies still sleeping in the ground. They show how the builders understood the rock before it became architecture. A pillar was not first born upright. It began horizontal, locked into the limestone bed, its future shape gradually freed by repeated blows and careful removal. The tools were simple in material, but not in use. Hammerstones could bruise and break. Flint blades could cut and scrape. Stone picks could open grooves. Wooden levers, ropes of plant fiber or hide, sledges, rollers, packed earth, and coordinated pulling may have served in the transport and raising of the stones. We cannot reconstruct every gesture with certainty, but the physical logic is unavoidable. Heavy stone demands organization, even when the quarry is nearby, even when gravity helps in places, even when the distances are short. A pillar weighing several tons does not move because one person wishes it so. It moves because a group acts as one body. This is where archaeology begins to reveal social structure through force. A tool mark is not just a mark, it is a trace of training. A quarry scar is not just damage, it is evidence of planning. A finished pillar is not just stone, it is the residue of meals prepared for workers, water carried to the ridge, tasks assigned, failures corrected, and decisions made by people who understood both the material and one another. The builders must have known sequence. First, select the right bedrock, then rough out the form, then detach it without splitting it fatally, then reduce weight without weakening the body, then shift the stone from quarry to enclosure, then raise it into position, then pack and stabilize it, then carve, polish, alter, or decorate it, depending on whether the imagery came before or after placement. Each step introduced danger. A stone could crack, a worker could be crushed, a rope could fail, a slope could turn from help into threat. A misjudged angle could trap the pillar halfway to its intended position. The success of Göbekli Tepe proves not only ambition, but experience. These people learned from attempts. They possessed practical knowledge transmitted through observation and repetition. They knew how limestone broke. They knew where to strike and where not to strike. They knew how many bodies were needed to shift a block. They knew how to prepare a setting deep enough to hold an upright stone. This was not blind labor, it was craft. The flint tools found at the site open another window into that craft world. Lithic analysis studies how stone tools were produced, used, resharpened, discarded, and distributed. In the debris of flint working, archaeologists can see choices. Raw materials were selected for quality. Blades were struck from prepared cores. Tools were shaped for cutting, scraping, piercing, butchering, and working other materials. The stone tool economy around Göbekli Tepe was not primitive clutter. It was a technical system, and a technical system implies teaching. Someone knew how to strike a core so that a blade came away clean. Someone knew how to prepare an edge sharp enough to slice hide or meat. Someone knew how to resharpen a tool before it failed. Someone watched, learned, copied, improved. Children may have sat near adults, imitating motions with poor quality stone. Skilled makers may have been valued for their hands and eyes. Certain families or groups may have carried traditions of tool production across generations. The first architects were also tool makers, hunters, cooks, carvers, planners, and storytellers. Their world did not separate professions in the way later cities would. Yet within that world, some people surely became known for particular abilities. One person carved animals better than another. One knew how to guide a heavy stone. One remembered the old placement of pillars. One could organize the pulling teams. One could speak the words that made the labor meaningful. The raising of a pillar may have been a communal event. Picture the stone lying ready. its body smoothed, its weight still terrifying. People gather around it at dawn. Ropes are tied. Wooden braces are set. Earth is banked where needed. Elders watch. Children are kept back. The first pull begins. Dust rises beneath feet. Voices synchronize the strain. The pillar shifts, resists, shifts again. Men and women lean into the ropes. Others wedge stones beneath the body. Someone calls out warnings. Someone sings. Perhaps to keep rhythm. Perhaps to calm fear. Perhaps because the stone is not merely being moved, but awakened. Then comes the critical moment. The pillar tilts upward. For an instant, it is neither earthbound nor secure. Its full weight becomes a danger suspended in motion. If it falls wrong, it can kill. If it settles right, it enters the world as presence. The base drops into its prepared socket. Packing stones are forced around it. Bodies release their strain. The great limestone figure stands. In that moment, engineering becomes ceremony. The achievement would have been visible to everyone present. The stone that no single human could command had been commanded by the group. Its upright body proved the power of cooperation. It showed that a community could act beyond the scale of ordinary life. Such labor changes people. Those who pull together remember the pull. Those who raise a stone are bound to it and to one another. This may have been one of the hidden powers of monument building. The finished enclosure mattered, but so did the process of making it. Construction itself could produce social unity. It could create obligation. It could establish leadership. It could turn scattered households or bands into a larger ritual community. To work on the stones was to participate in something greater than survival. The monument did not merely express society. It helped make society. The absence of metal makes the achievement more impressive, not less. Metal tools are strong, but stone tools in skilled hands can accomplish astonishing work. The builders operated within the limits of their materials and mastered those limits. Their technology was not measured by what they lacked, but by what they achieved. No copper chisels, no bronze saws, no iron wedges. Yet there stood the pillars, straight and massive, their surfaces carrying images that outlasted the languages of their makers. The enclosures also required architectural knowledge. The walls were not random piles. They curved. They framed space. They linked pillars into a coherent plan. Benches or low stone features in some areas may have shaped how people sat, moved, or watched. The ground surface had to be prepared. Drainage, stability, visibility, access, and sequence of construction all mattered. Even if the structures were open to the sky, they were built environments, designed to guide bodies and attention. This is architecture at the edge of settlement. It does not look like a house in the ordinary sense. It does not look like a palace, fortress, or later temple. It belongs to a category that unsettles categories. Its builders were not yet urban architects, but neither were they merely arranging stones. They were creating planned ceremonial space at a scale previously thought unlikely for such an early period. And still, tools alone cannot explain why. A hammerstone can shape limestone, but it cannot explain a sacred animal. A rope can move a pillar, but it cannot explain why a pillar must stand. A quarry can provide material, but it cannot explain memory. The technical and the spiritual were entangled. The same hand that struck the stone may have believed it was releasing something from within the rock. The same group that hauled the pillar may have believed it was fulfilling an obligation to ancestors. spirits, or powers of the land. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made, but the evidence already strips away one old prejudice completely. These people were not waiting for civilization to teach them organization. They already had it. They did not need writing to coordinate labor. They did not need kings to move stone. They did not need cities to design monumental space. They possessed social intelligence, practical engineering, material knowledge, and a symbolic world strong enough to bring human bodies together in great effort. The tools of the first architects were not only flint and limestone, they were rhythm, trust, memory, instruction, hunger, devotion, ambition, and awe. They were the spoken plan, the repeated gesture, the shared meal, the known path to the quarry, the old hand guiding the young hand, the pull of the rope, the chant beneath the sky, the final silence when the pillar stood upright and became more than stone. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The quarry scars remain, but not the voices. The flint remains, but not the hand that held it. The pillar remains, but not the first gasp when it rose into the light. Yet in every worked surface there is a trace of human intention. In every carved edge there is patience. In every lifted stone there is a community made visible. Göbekli Tepe was built with tools of stone, but it was born from a technology far older and far more powerful, the ability of human beings to imagine together, labor together, and leave behind a monument that makes the deep past feel suddenly, astonishingly close. At Göbekli Tepe, the dead stones are surrounded by the remains of life. Bone lies among rubble, and flint lies among ash. Broken fragments of animals, tools, and worked stone lie packed inside the ancient deposits, as if the hill had swallowed the evidence of many gatherings and kept it sealed in its belly. These remains are not glamorous in the way carved pillars are glamorous. They do not rise 5 meters into the air. They do not carry the image of fox or serpent, yet they may bring us closer to the actual pulse of the place, for every monument needs a crowd, and every crowd needs food. The animal bones from Göbekli Tepe tell of hunting on a large scale. Gazelle appear in great numbers, along with wild cattle, wild boar, wild sheep, wild ass, fox, hare, birds, and other creatures from the living world around the hill. This was not the refuse of a later farming village filled with domestic herds. It was the debris of hunters, processors, cooks, eaters, and perhaps ritual specialists working with the bodies of wild animals. The bones are cracked, cut, scattered, burned, and deposited. They speak of butchery. They speak of meals. They speak of gatherings where meat was divided, consumed, and remembered. A feast is never only a feast. It is a social machine. It can bind strangers together. It can create debt. It can display skill, generosity, courage, or power. It can turn a successful hunt into a public event, and a public event into lasting authority. In a world without coins, taxes, written contracts, or royal decrees, food could become a language of obligation. Who killed the animal? Who prepared the meat? Who received the best portions? Who watched from the edge? Who was honored? Who was excluded? Every feast answers these questions, even when no one speaks them aloud. The scale of activity at Göbekli Tepe suggests that people came together in numbers greater than an ordinary household camp. If groups arrived from different parts of the surrounding landscape, then food would have been essential, not merely for survival, but for ceremony. A gathering around the pillars would require coordination. Hunters would need to know where animals moved. Carcasses would need to be carried, butchered, cooked, and shared. Water would need to be brought or accessed. Plant foods would need to be gathered and processed. Fires would need tending through the night. The scent of such a gathering is almost lost to us, but not entirely beyond imagination. Smoke rising into cold evening air, fat dripping into flame, fresh blood darkening the dust, stone blades cutting through hide, bone cracking under force, grain or seeds crushed on grinding stones, children drawn close by hunger and curiosity, elders seated near the warmth, watching the order of distribution, the pillars above them, pale in daylight, glowing in firelight. Feasting can also transform danger into meaning. To hunt wild cattle or boar was to face animals capable of killing a person. To bring such creatures to the hill was to bring the wild into the sacred center. Meat carried the memory of pursuit, risk, and success. Horns, skulls, skins, claws, tusks, feathers, and bones could become more than leftovers. They could become offerings, ornaments, trophies, teaching objects, or ritual materials. The animal body may have been divided between stomach and spirit, some parts eaten, some displayed, some discarded, some deposited intentionally, some perhaps carried away. Zoo archaeology studies these remains with careful attention. Species are identified, cut marks are examined, burning patterns are recorded, age profiles are reconstructed. The location of bones within deposits is mapped. Through this work, archaeologists try to move from scattered fragments toward vanished behavior. A gazelle bone is not just a gazelle bone. It may reveal season, hunting strategy, processing method, and the scale of consumption. If many gazelle were killed around the same time, that may point to seasonal hunts. Gazelle migrations or local concentrations could have created moments of abundance. Such moments would be ideal for gatherings. A community does not hold a great feast when the land offers nothing. It gathers when the world provides enough to make generosity possible. This may have shaped the calendar of the hill. Perhaps people came when herds were near. Perhaps they came when wild grain could be harvested. Perhaps they came when both meat and plant foods were available in quantity. Perhaps the ritual year followed the ecological year so closely that the two were inseparable. In such a world, the sacred did not float above daily life. It arrived through the body, through hunger, through chewing, through smoke in the eyes and grease on the hands, through the warmth of many bodies gathered together in the night, through the gratitude and fear that follow a successful hunt, through the knowledge that abundance is temporary and must be honored while it lasts. There is also the question of drink. Some scholars have suggested that large stone vessels and evidence for plant processing may hint at the production of fermented beverages in early Neolithic ritual contexts. Certainty remains elusive, and caution is essential. Yet the idea is powerful, because feasting societies around the world often use special drinks to intensify gatherings, alter mood, mark ceremonies, and create shared experience. If fermented drink was present at Göbekli Tepe, then the hill may have echoed not only with speech and song, but with the heightened energy of celebration. Ritual intoxication, if it occurred, could have changed how people perceived the pillars, the firelight, the animal carvings, and one another. But even without such drink, the gathering itself would have carried emotional force. A crowd, a hunt, a meal, a monument, a night sky, and the presence of remembered powers are enough to alter the mind. Food can also build hierarchy quietly. In later societies, rulers gain power by controlling grain, herds, land, and labor. At Göbekli Tepe, there is no clear evidence for kings, palaces, or permanent ruling classes, yet influence could still exist. The best hunters, the best organizers, the elders who knew the rites, the carvers whose hands gave form to spirits, the families able to sponsor large meals, all could gain prestige. This prestige may have been temporary, contested, seasonal, and deeply embedded in ritual. Not yet monarchy, not yet priest-kings, but perhaps the first faint outlines of social ranking, appearing not through crowns, but through meat, memory, and stone. Feasts create stories. A hunt that feeds many people becomes remembered. A pillar raised after such a feast becomes tied to the names of those who organized it. A dangerous animal carved into limestone may recall an event everyone present understood. Over generations, such stories can thicken into tradition. The original hunt is forgotten, the animal remains. The ritual continues. The meaning deepens and shifts. This is how culture becomes layered. One meal becomes a memory. One memory becomes a ceremony. One ceremony becomes a monument. One monument becomes a sacred landscape. The bones at Göbekli Tepe may also speak of waste, but waste in ritual contexts is never simple. A modern observer may see discarded debris. An ancient participant may have seen proper deposition. What is thrown away in one culture is offered in another. What appears as rubble may be closure. What appears as kitchen refuse may be the remains of a sacred meal. The challenge is to avoid making the past too ordinary or too mystical. It was both practical and symbolic, because human life is always both. The builders ate because they were hungry. They gathered because they needed one another. They feasted because food could turn many bodies into one community. And perhaps they placed the remains among the stones because the meal belonged not only to the living. Ancestors may have been present in memory. Spirits may have been invoked. The dead may have been imagined as watchers, owners, or guests. The great pillars may have stood over the meals like silent hosts. If the central figures represented ancestors or powerful beings, then every feast occurred beneath their authority. To eat there was to enter a relationship with the unseen. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The bones cannot tell us the song sung over the meat. The ashes cannot tell us whether the first portion was offered to the stones. The grinding stones cannot tell us whose hands prepared the plant foods. The deposits cannot tell us whether laughter, grief, fear, or ecstasy filled the night. Yet they tell us enough to see that Göbekli Tepe was not only a place of stone, it was a place of bodies, human bodies pulling ropes, carving surfaces, dancing, carrying, cutting, cooking, eating, aging, remembering, and dying. Animal bodies hunted, butchered, consumed, displayed, and returned to the earth in fragments. Stone bodies standing at the center of it all, refusing decay. The feast beneath the pillars may have been one of the earliest engines of large-scale human cooperation. Not the cold machinery of the state, but the warmth of shared food and shared awe. The community gathered, the fires burned, the animals were eaten. The stories grew larger, and somewhere in that fusion of hunger and holiness, the first temples became possible. For many years, Göbekli Tepe was imagined as a temple standing apart from daily life, a high place of ritual, A sacred ridge, a monument where hunter-gatherers came together for ceremonies, feasts, and encounters with powers beyond the ordinary world. That image remains powerful. It may still hold part of the truth, yet the ground has continued to speak, and archaeology is rarely kind to simple categories. The more carefully the hill and its surrounding landscape have been studied, the more difficult it becomes to separate the sacred from the domestic, the ceremonial from the practical, the temple from the settlement. This is not a failure of interpretation. It is a sign that ancient life did not follow modern boundaries. Today, people often divide buildings by function. A house is for living, a church is for worship, a workshop is for production, a market is for exchange, a cemetery is for the dead. These divisions are useful, but they are not universal. In many ancient societies, the house could hold ancestors. The hearth could be sacred. The storage room could be ritualized. The grave could lie beneath the floor. The meal could be an offering. The ordinary could be full of gods. Göbekli Tepe forces this lesson with unusual intensity. The monumental enclosures are extraordinary, but they do not exist in a vacuum. Excavations and surveys have revealed structures that look smaller, more rectangular, and more closely tied to daily occupation. There are grinding stones, flint tools, refuse deposits, water-related features, and evidence of repeated human presence. The old picture of a lonely sanctuary visited only for special ceremonies has become harder to defend in its simplest form. Was Göbekli Tepe a settlement with ritual buildings? Was it a ritual center with residential activity around it? Was it something in between? A place where living, working, eating, remembering, and worshipping formed one continuous landscape? The question itself may be too modern for the people who made the hill meaningful. Sleeping near sacred stones may not have made the place less sacred. Grinding grain near a ceremonial enclosure may not have felt like a contradiction. Repairing tools, cooking food, and honoring unseen beings may all have belonged to the same rhythm of life. The sacred did not have to be isolated to be powerful. This possibility changes the emotional picture of the site. Instead of imagining the hill as silent, except during rare ceremonies, we might imagine longer occupations, smoke rising from hearths, people shaping flint in the shade, children carrying water, elders sitting near walls, travelers arriving from other places, animal hides drying, seeds being processed, ritual specialists preparing objects or stories, builders working on new structures while older enclosures stood nearby, already heavy with memory. The monumental spaces may have been part of a living community, not a city, not a village in the later agricultural sense, but a place where residence and ritual overlapped during certain periods, perhaps seasonally, perhaps more permanently than once thought. Evidence for cereal processing complicates the picture further. Grinding stones and plant remains suggest that wild grains were important. To process cereals requires labor. Stalks must be gathered, seeds separated, husks removed, kernels ground, flour or meal prepared. This is not casual snacking. It is repeated work, often involving groups, tools, storage, and planning. Such work may have supported gatherings at the hill. It may also have encouraged people to remain near the place longer. A community that invests in monuments may need dependable food. A community that processes grain repeatedly may begin to notice which plants grow best, which seeds are worth saving, which patches return strongly, and which areas should be revisited. Over generations, the distance between gathering wild cereals and cultivating them can narrow. The settlement question therefore reaches into the origins of farming. If Göbekli Tepe was only a remote sanctuary, then ritual pulled people away from ordinary subsistence places. If it included domestic activity, then ritual and the early steps toward settled life were unfolding together on the same ground. Either way, the old division between economy and belief begins to blur. Water is another key to the problem. A place can inspire awe, but people cannot remain long without water. The limestone landscape around Göbekli Tepe includes cistern-like features, channels, and natural depressions that may have held or directed rainwater. How water was obtained, stored, and managed remains an important question. Even seasonal gatherings require planning for thirst. If people occupied the hill for extended periods, water management becomes even more central. Water often turns sacred landscapes into social landscapes. Those who know where water lies hold knowledge. Those who maintain basins or channels perform service. Those who gather around water form routines. The practical need becomes part of the place's identity. A ceremony may begin with arrival at the ridge, but it cannot continue without the hidden labor of fetching, storing, and sharing water. Smaller buildings also demand attention. Rectangular structures may represent later phases of activity. When architectural habits were changing across the early Neolithic world, circular or oval monumental forms gave way in some contexts to more rectilinear planning. Such changes are never merely technical. A different building form can reflect different social patterns, different household arrangements, different ideas of space, ownership, privacy, and community. The movement from round to rectangular architecture across the broader Neolithic has often been linked to the growing importance of settled households. A circular space gathers people around a center. A rectangular space can be added to, divided, repeated, aligned, and clustered. The geometry of architecture can reveal the geometry of society. At Göbekli Tepe, the mixture of forms suggests a long sequence of change. The hill was not frozen in one idea. People returned, built, modified, filled, repurposed, and reimagined. The site had time within it. It witnessed shifting ways of gathering, organizing, and inhabiting the ridge. The word temple therefore becomes both useful and dangerous. Useful because the monumental enclosures clearly carry symbolic and ritual weight. Dangerous because temple often makes us think of later institutions, priests, offerings, official doctrine, and a strict separation from ordinary life. Göbekli Tepe is older than those worlds. Its sacred architecture may have operated according to principles we do not yet understand. Calling it a temple helps us feel its importance, but may also make it too familiar. The same is true of the word settlement. Settlement suggests houses, daily routines, families, refuse, storage, work, and continuity. Some of these may fit, others may mislead. The site may have been occupied intensely but seasonally. It may have hosted rotating groups. It may have supported specialists during construction phases. It may have functioned differently across centuries. One label may not cover all phases, all spaces, or all communities involved. This is why the question should remain alive. Temple or settlement? Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. Perhaps a kind of place that existed before our categories hardened? A place where people lived with their rituals, a place where the dead The wild, the sacred, and the practical met in daily gestures. A place where the grinding of grain, the carving of animals, the eating of meat, the raising of pillars, and the telling of origin stories all belonged to one integrated way of being in the world. Such a vision does not reduce the mystery. It deepens it. If Göbekli Tepe was not isolated from life, then its power may have touched every aspect of the community. Not only festival moments, but ordinary mornings. Not only rare ceremonies, but the routine labor of hands. A child growing up near those pillars would not see them as museum objects or special ruins. They would be part of the visible world, as normal and terrifying as the horizon. To live near sacred architecture is to learn its meanings with the body. You pass it at sunrise. You hear adults speak differently near it. You are warned not to touch certain stones. You see animals carved into surfaces before you understand why. You attend feasts, funerals, initiations, repairs, and gatherings. You learn that the world has layers and that some places are heavier than others. This may be one of Göbekli Tepe's greatest gifts to archaeology. It breaks the habit of thinking that religion begins only in special buildings, or that domestic life is merely practical. Early humans did not live in a stripped-down material world and then add belief as decoration. Meaning was already there, in food, stone, animal, death, weather, kinship, and place. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The smaller buildings do not explain every enclosure. The grinding stones do not tell us who lived there. The water features do not reveal the length of occupation. The refuse does not separate sacred debris from ordinary trash with perfect clarity. The hill remains complex, layered, and resistant, but that resistance is honest. Göbekli Tepe was not made for our categories. It was made by people whose world joined what we divide. Their sacred places may have been lived in. Their living places may have been sacred. Their monuments may have been homes for memory. Ancestors, spirits, gatherings, labor, and food all at once. So the question is not whether the hill was a temple or a settlement. The deeper question is what kind of human world existed before such words had separate walls around them. At Göbekli Tepe, the answer stands in limestone, surrounded by tools, bones, buildings, fills, and silence. It tells us that civilization did not emerge from one clean invention. It rose from entanglement, from hands grinding grain beside carved pillars, from hunters feasting beneath sacred stones, from people who could make a place both home and threshold, both workshop and shrine, both daily ground and doorway into the unseen. The oldest explanations of civilization often begin with the field. A human hand scatters seed. Rain falls, grain grows, the harvest is gathered, food is stored, surplus appears. Surplus feeds specialists. Specialists become priests, builders, soldiers, rulers, scribes, and merchants. Villages grow into towns. Towns become cities. Cities raise temples, walls, and palaces. The story is tidy, persuasive, and powerful. But Göbekli Tepe disturbs that order. It asks whether the first great gathering force was not the field, but the shrine, not the granary, but the sacred place, not the command of kings, but the pull of belief. This does not mean farming was unimportant. Agriculture transformed human history with a force almost beyond measure. It changed diets, bodies, landscapes, disease patterns, settlement, fertility, labor, property, warfare, and hierarchy. But the existence of monumental ritual architecture so early in the story suggests that belief and ceremony may have played a far more active role in the origins of social complexity than once imagined. The question is not whether people needed food. They did. The question is why they organized themselves at such scale before the full machinery of farming society had appeared. A purely economic explanation struggles to account for the emotional intensity of the site. The pillars are not storage bins. The carved animals are not simple hunting records. The enclosures are not efficient shelters. The labor invested in the hill exceeds the needs of ordinary survival. Something else was at work, something capable of drawing bodies together, focusing effort, and making a community accept difficulty for a purpose that cannot be eaten. That something may have been religion, though even this word must be handled carefully. Religion, in a modern sense, can suggest scriptures, temples, priesthoods, doctrines, sacred laws, and named gods. The people of Göbekli Tepe left none of these in readable form. They may not have separated religion from daily life. They may not have had a word equivalent to religion at all. Their world may have been alive with agencies, ancestors, animal powers, places of danger, places of renewal, and obligations between the living and the unseen. Yet whatever we call it, the evidence points toward shared symbolic action. The builders created spaces that shaped attention. They carved beings into stone. They gathered around images that were repeated and arranged. They buried enclosures in acts that seemed deliberate and meaningful. They returned to the hill across generations. These are not random behaviors. They are ritual behaviors, or at the very least, behaviors saturated with social meaning. Ritual has extraordinary power. It can make strangers feel related. It can transform fear into order. It can turn memory into obligation. It can create authority without permanent government. It can bind people to a place even when they do not live there continuously. It can make labor feel necessary because the task belongs to the ancestors, the spirits, the hunt, the dead, or the beginning of the world. Imagine a community without writing, without royal law, without police, without coins, without administrative seals. How does it gather people beyond the scale of close kin? How does it persuade them to work? How does it prevent violence between groups? How does it create trust across distance? Shared ceremony is one answer. A sacred place can become neutral ground, or dangerous ground, or holy ground, where ordinary rivalries are suspended or transformed. Groups that might compete for hunting territories can meet under the gaze of the same stone beings. People who marry across groups can renew alliances there. Elders can tell stories that define a wider identity. Young people can be initiated into obligations that reach beyond their household. Food can be shared, debts created, and conflicts resolved under the pressure of collective awe. In such a world, religion is not a private belief. It is infrastructure. It is a road made of memory. It is a law without tablets. It is a gathering system before bureaucracy. It is the invisible architecture that makes visible architecture possible. This is the great reversal that Göbekli Tepe places before us. Perhaps temples did not arise only when farmers became rich enough to build them. Perhaps sacred gathering helped create the conditions that made farming desirable, or even necessary. If people came together regularly at certain places, they needed food in predictable quantities. If feasts became central to social life, then wild resources had to be managed more carefully. If ritual obligations required repeated gatherings, then communities may have begun to cultivate plants, not simply to survive, but to sustain ceremony. In other words, bread may have followed belief, the field may have grown in the shadow of the pillar. This is not a simple replacement of one theory with another. Human history rarely moves through a single cause. Climate mattered, population mattered, plant availability mattered, hunting patterns mattered, technology mattered, social competition mattered, but Göbekli Tepe makes it difficult to deny that symbolic life mattered as well, and perhaps mattered at the deepest level. The human being is not only a hungry animal, the human being is also a meaning-making animal. We do not merely ask what can be eaten, we ask what must be remembered. We ask where the dead have gone. We ask why animals move in their season. We ask why the sky changes. We ask why suffering comes. We ask what powers govern birth, death, sickness, and abundance. We ask who we are when we gather beneath the night. At Göbekli Tepe, those questions seem to have taken architectural form. The stone enclosures may have been places where the living confronted the great problems of existence: death, animal power, group identity, cosmic order, transformation, and renewal. The images do not speak plainly, yet their seriousness is unmistakable. No one carves such beings, raises such pillars, and buries such spaces for trivial reasons. The scale of the work suggests that belief could motivate labor where coercion is not evident. Later states would force people to build through taxation, corvée labor, slavery, military authority, or divine kingship. At Göbekli Tepe, the mechanisms were likely different. Influence may have rested in persuasion, tradition, charisma, kinship, ritual knowledge, and the prestige of organizing feasts. The builders may have worked because they believed the work was necessary, because their group identity demanded it, because refusal was socially impossible, because the stones belonged to the order of the world. That kind of power is subtle, but immense. A god does not need a tax collector if the people themselves fear neglecting the right. An ancestor does not need a palace if memory binds the living tightly enough. A sacred place does not need walls if everyone knows the hill must be approached with care. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know whether the builders prayed. We do not know whether they sacrificed. We do not know whether they believed the pillars were alive, inhabited, symbolic, ancestral, or divine. We do not know whether specialists controlled access to the enclosures or whether ceremonies were communal. We do not know whether women and men participated equally, or whether certain rites belonged to particular ages, lineages, or groups. But the stones revealed that human cooperation had already crossed a threshold. People were no longer only adapting to the world as they found it. They were making places that changed how society gathered, remembered, and imagined itself. They were investing labor in shared meanings so powerful that those meanings could organize bodies on the landscape. This is civilization before the city. Not civilization in the later sense of walls, taxes, armies, and writing, but civilization as a deep human capacity for collective imagination, the ability to make symbols public, the ability to build for the unseen, the ability to gather around a story so compelling that stone, hunger, danger, and effort are all drawn into its orbit. Göbekli Tepe does not prove that religion created civilization by itself. Nothing so vast has a single mother, but it does show that the sacred was present at the beginning. not as an ornament placed on top of settled life, but as one of the engines that may have pulled settled life into being. It shows that people who had not yet built cities could still create centers. It shows that the first great architecture may have been born from awe rather than administration. And perhaps this should not surprise us. Even now, human beings cross oceans for sacred places. They fast, build, sing, mourn, march, kneel, donate, and gather because of invisible commitments. Modern life has not erased the power of belief to organize bodies and shape landscapes. Why should the deep past have been different? The people of Göbekli Tepe looked out upon a wild world of animals, weather, death, hunger, beauty, and danger. They answered not only with tools and food, but with monuments. They carved a vision into limestone and made others come to it. They gave the sacred weight. They made mystery stand upright. And in doing so, they left us with a question that still overturns the old ladder of progress. Did civilization build the temple, or did the temple help build civilization? One of the strangest acts at Göbekli Tepe was not the building of the great enclosures. It was their burial. At some point, the immense circles of limestone, with their carved animals and central pillars, were packed with earth, rubble, stone debris, animal bones, flint tools, and broken fragments. The spaces that had once opened beneath the sky were filled. The pillars were swallowed. The carved beings were covered. The sacred chambers, if chambers they were, vanished into the body of the hill. This was not simple collapse. A fallen building leaves a certain kind of ruin. Walls tumble, roofs cave in, wind brings dust, rain moves sediment. Plants grow, animals burrow, time covers what people abandon. But Göbekli Tepe presents something more deliberate, more human, more unsettling. The enclosures appear to have been intentionally backfilled. The act required labor. It required choice. It required a community to take what had been raised with immense effort and bury it with immense effort. Why? This question has no easy answer, and perhaps it should not have one. The burial of a sacred place can mean many things. It can be closure, it can be protection, it can be renewal. It can be abandonment without disrespect. It can be a way of returning power to the earth. It can be a ritual death. The modern mind often assumes that building is creation and burial is destruction. But many ancient societies did not think so simply. To cover something was not always to erase it. A grave covers a body, yet preserves memory. A mound covers a tomb, yet marks importance. A sealed chamber may be hidden precisely because what lies inside remains powerful. Concealment can be reverence. The enclosures of Göbekli Tepe may have had life cycles. A space might be built for a particular generation, group, season, ancestor, or ceremonial purpose. It might be used for a time, renewed, altered, and then closed. When its moment ended, it may have been inappropriate to leave it exposed. The beings within it may have needed to be put to rest. The stories connected to it may have required a formal ending. The burial may have been the last ceremony of the enclosure, the final act that completed rather than destroyed it. Imagine the closing of one of these places. The central pillars still stand, scarred by years of smoke, touch, weather, and watching. The carved animals have already become old. Some people remember when the stones were first raised. Others know the enclosure only as something inherited. A decision is made, perhaps by elders, perhaps by ritual specialists, perhaps by a wider gathering. The space will be filled. People bring baskets of earth. They carry limestone fragments. They bring bones from meals, waste from tool-making, broken objects, debris from the living surface of the site. The fill rises slowly around the pillars. First, the feet disappear, then the lower bodies, then the carved hands, then the animals. What had once towered above the living is gradually lowered into darkness without moving at all. This would have been a powerful thing to witness. A monument does not vanish in a moment. It disappears by layers. Those present would have watched the familiar become hidden. The enclosure's shape would have changed with every load. Voices once echoing around open stone would be muffled. The central figures would sink into the hill, not by falling, but by being covered. If the burial was ritual, then the materials placed inside may have carried meaning. Animal bones could mark feasts, offerings, memories of hunts, or the remains of ceremonies. Flint tools could represent labor, identity, or ordinary refuse gathered into sacred closure. Broken stone fragments might come from older carvings, damaged pillars, or construction debris. The fill was not clean. It was mixed, dense, alive with traces of activity. Perhaps this mattered. Perhaps the enclosure was not buried with sterile soil because it needed to be filled with the material of life. A sacred place might require the remains of the people who had used it, their meals, their tools, their broken images, their dust. The burial preserved the site in a remarkable way. By covering the pillars and enclosures, the ancient builders protected them from weathering, erosion, and later destruction. They sealed the carvings in darkness, allowing them to survive across ages that would have destroyed exposed surfaces. In a strange twist of history, the act that hid Göbekli Tepe from human memory helped save it for archaeology. But preservation was probably not their goal in a modern sense. They were not making a museum for the future. They were completing an act in their own world. The burial also raises questions about change. If older enclosures were closed and newer structures built elsewhere on the mound, then the hill was constantly being rewritten. It was not a static sanctuary, but a living sequence of construction and concealment. Each generation inherited a landscape already full of buried presences. The visible hill was only the upper skin of a deeper sacred body. To stand there in later phases would be to stand above the hidden. People may have known that older stones lay beneath their feet. They may have remembered certain buried enclosures and stories. They may have pointed to places where the ancestors slept under rubble. The mound itself would grow as memory accumulated. The hill became not only a platform for architecture, but an archive made of concealment. This is one of the most profound aspects of the site. Göbekli Tepe was not simply built on a hill. It became a hill through human action. The mound's shape is the result of building, filling, rebuilding, and refilling. Sacred activity created topography. Human memory became geology. The hill was not just a place chosen by people. It was a place made by people, layer upon layer, intention upon intention. The deliberate filling of enclosures may also reflect changing beliefs. A symbol that once held central power may lose its role. A ritual form may become outdated. New communities may reinterpret older spaces. The great circular enclosures may have belonged to a world of gathering that gradually gave way to more settled forms of life, more domestic architecture, different social arrangements, and new ideas about where sacred power should reside. But transition does not mean rejection. The past can be honored by covering it. An old sacred space may be buried, so that a new one can be born without desecrating the old. The earth becomes a boundary between ages. The fill marks a passage. The visible world changes, while the hidden world remains charged beneath it. There may also have been practical reasons intertwined with ritual ones. Structures age, stones lean, walls weaken, spaces become difficult to maintain. A dangerous or unstable enclosure might be filled to prevent collapse. But even if practical concerns mattered, the scale and character of the backfilling suggest that utility alone is not enough. Ancient people often solved practical problems through meaningful acts. Repair, abandonment, and closure could all be ritualized. No single cause needs to dominate. A sacred enclosure might be buried because it was old, because its rituals ended, because a generation died, because new buildings were planned, because its stones were too powerful to leave exposed, because the hill story demanded accumulation, because memory required depth. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know whether people mourned when an enclosure was filled. We do not know whether they celebrated. We do not know whether the last glimpse of the central pillars was met with silence, chanting, fear, relief, or indifference. We do not know whether children asked why the stone beings had to disappear. We do not know whether elders answered with a story that began at the creation of the world. But the act itself remains. The builders raised stones into the light, then they returned them to darkness. This rhythm of revelation and concealment may be one of the keys to understanding the hill. A monument does not have to remain visible forever to matter. Some powers grow stronger when hidden. Some memories become sacred because they are inaccessible. Some places hold authority precisely because everyone knows there is more beneath the surface than any eye can see. Göbekli Tepe is therefore not only a monument of construction, it is a monument of burial, a site where creation and closure were joined, where sacred architecture was born, lived, and died, where the earth became both womb and tomb. The enclosures were not merely abandoned to time, they were placed inside time, packed into the mound as if the hill itself were being fed with memory. And this burial leaves us answerless, adrift to ponder. Did the people hide their gods? Did they put their ancestors to rest? Did they close one world so another could open? Did they fear the stones, love them, or both? Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. Yet the buried enclosures already reveal something essential about the people who made them. They understood endings. They gave form not only to presence, but to absence. They knew that what is covered is not always gone, and that memory can survive beneath earth, waiting through the long silence until hands from another age uncover the stones again. Göbekli Tepe was not alone. For a long time it seemed to stand in splendid isolation, a single, impossible summit in the deep Neolithic landscape. Its great pillars appeared so early, so strange and so powerful that it was tempting to imagine the hill as a unique eruption of human imagination, a lightning strike in stone, unmatched and unexplained. But the surrounding region has begun to reveal a wider story. Across the stone hills of southeastern Anatolia, other ancient places have emerged from the dust, some known to villagers for generations, others recognized through excavation, survey, and the patient re-examination of landscapes once thought familiar. These places do not merely decorate the map around Göbekli Tepe, they transform the question. If one site is astonishing, a network is revolutionary. The broader region contains ridges, plateaus, springs, valleys, and limestone outcrops that would have offered both material and meaning to early Neolithic communities. As archaeologists have investigated more of this landscape, they have encountered carved stones, special buildings, human-like pillars, animal imagery, and architectural traditions that seem to belong to the same vast horizon of belief and experimentation. One of the most important of these places is Karahan Tepe. There, the earth has yielded its own strange architecture and carved forms, including T-shaped elements and a remarkable chamber containing stone projections that rise from the floor like a crowd of silent presences. The place feels related to Göbekli Tepe, yet not identical. It is not a copy. It has its own personality, its own arrangement of space, its own grammar of stone. Together, these sites suggest that the builders of the early Neolithic were not creating isolated wonders, but participating in a shared world of symbols, techniques, gatherings, and sacred landscapes. This changes everything. It means that the knowledge required to carve pillars and organize monumental spaces was not confined to a single hilltop. It moved through communities. It was remembered, taught, adapted, and transformed. Different groups may have shared ideas about the human body, animals, ancestors, death, and sacred space while expressing those ideas in local ways. The result was not uniformity, but a family resemblance across the hills. The stone hills become a cultural horizon, a region of related experiments, a landscape where human beings were learning, on a scale never seen before, how to turn place into memory, and memory into architecture. Such a network implies communication. People traveled, news spread. Skilled carvers may have moved between communities. Ritual specialists may have visited distant places. Marriage partners may have carried stories from one valley to another. Hunters may have exchanged knowledge during seasonal gatherings. Objects, techniques, and images may have circulated along paths now invisible to the eye. The hills were not silent islands. They were connected by feet. The modern map can make the past seem fixed, divided by lines and names. But for early communities, the world was a web of roots. A ridge was not a boundary if people crossed it. A valley was not remote if animals moved through it. A spring could become a meeting point. A quarry could attract craftspeople. A sacred place could draw groups from distances that seem modest to us, but immense in terms of social experience. The existence of multiple related sites also complicates the idea of a single origin. Perhaps there was no one first temple in the simple sense. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe is the most famous surviving expression of a broader movement already spreading through the region. Perhaps monumental ritual architecture arose through repeated experiments, some small, some grand, some abandoned, some transformed, some still buried. The first temple may not have been one building, but a process. That process had deep roots in mobile life. Foragers do not live without place. They often maintain extensive territories full of named features, remembered events, burial locations, dangerous zones, favored camps, and sacred points. As groups in southeastern Anatolia began to gather more frequently and invest more labor in particular locations, certain places may have intensified. A hill became more than a hill. A quarry became more than a source. A meeting ground became more than a camp. Over time, places began to compete for memory. The Stone Hills network may reflect this intensification. Each site could have served a different community, season, rite, lineage, or landscape zone. Some may have been places of initiation, some of feasting, some of mortuary practice, some of aggregation and exchange, some of daily life fused with ritual. The similarities show shared tradition. The differences show local creativity. This matters because it restores the builders as historical actors. They were not a faceless mass responding mechanically to climate or food. They were innovators. They experimented with form. They borrowed and transformed ideas. They shaped their own communities through architecture. One group raised central pillars, another carved different figures, another cut chambers into bedrock, another arranged stones in a new pattern. The early Neolithic was not a single invention, but a conversation across generations, and that conversation took place without writing. No tablets were needed for traditions to spread. Human memory carried plans, myths, techniques, gestures, and songs. A person who had seen one great enclosure could describe it elsewhere. A carver could teach a younger apprentice how to form a T-shaped pillar. A ritual leader could adapt a story to a new hill. A group could take an inherited symbol and give it local power. This is cultural transmission in its oldest form. Voice, gesture, imitation, journey, repetition. The stone hills also reveal that the sacred geography of the period may have been far more complex than once imagined. Instead of a single central sanctuary drawing everyone to one point, there may have been many centers, each anchoring a different web of relationships. People may have moved between them over a lifetime, gaining identity through participation in multiple places. A person might be born near one hill, married through gatherings at another, initiated at a third, and buried in a landscape known through stories that linked them all. The network may have helped create a wider sense of belonging, not a state, not a nation, not an empire, but a cultural world, recognizable across distances through shared forms and repeated signs. The T-shaped pillar may have been one of those signs. Its recurrence across sites suggests that it carried a meaning understood broadly enough to travel. Yet its meaning remains hidden. It may represent a stylized human body, an ancestral being, a spirit form, or a sacred convention beyond our vocabulary. Whatever it meant, it was powerful enough to be repeated, and flexible enough to appear in different contexts. Animal imagery may have served a similar role. Foxes, snakes, boars, birds, and other creatures belonged not only to local ecology, but to symbolic thought. The repetition of such animals across sites may reveal shared myths or shared ritual concerns. Yet each carving is also local, shaped by the hands and choices of particular makers. The animals are both part of a tradition and individual acts of imagination. The emerging network has another profound implication. Many sites may still lie hidden. If Göbekli Tepe could remain buried beneath a rounded hill for thousands of years, and if other places are now being recognized across the region, then the archaeological map is almost certainly incomplete. The known sites may be only the visible tips of a much larger sacred landscape, beneath fields, villages, roads, and unexamined ridges. Further stones may wait. Some may be damaged, some may be gone, some may remain sealed, their carvings as fresh as the day they were covered. Only Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. This uncertainty gives the region an almost mythic depth. The land is not exhausted, it is still withholding. Every survey, every trench, every careful examination of limestone fragments may change the story again. The first temple may become the first temples. The unique wonder may become the best-known member of a whole forgotten tradition. The question of who built Göbekli Tepe may expand into a larger question. Who were the peoples of the stone hills? What bound them together? What separated them? What stories moved with them across the ridges? What ceremonies gave their world shape? Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The network has no written map. No ancient itinerary lists the sacred hills. No carved inscription names the communities who gathered there. We must reconstruct connection through architecture, iconography, stone technology, radiocarbon dating, settlement patterns, environmental study, and the distribution of material culture. The evidence is powerful, but incomplete, like hearing distant music through stone. Yet even incomplete, the pattern is unmistakable. Göbekli Tepe belongs to a broader awakening of monumental imagination in the early Neolithic Near East. It was part of a world in motion, a world where communities were experimenting with permanence, gathering, symbolic authority, and place. The stone hills were not the silent edge of civilization. They were one of the laboratories in which civilization's deepest habits were being formed. To build in stone is to say that memory matters. To repeat a form across landscapes is to say that memory can travel. To gather at many sacred centers is to begin making a world larger than the campfire, larger than the hunting band, larger than the household. And so the limestone hills of southeastern Anatolia rise before us not as isolated ruins, but as a constellation, each site a dim star, each pillar a signal, each buried chamber a withheld sentence. Together they suggest that, at the dawn of settled life, human beings were not merely adapting to a new world. They were linking places into meaning, carving a sacred geography across the land, and teaching stone to remember what voices could not preserve forever. The world of the builders did not end in fire. No layer of ash tells of a conquering army sweeping over the ridge. No broken gate marks the arrival of invaders. No royal inscription boasts that the sacred stones were overthrown. The transformation was quieter than that, and perhaps more profound. It happened through centuries of altered habits, shifting needs, new houses, new foods, new obligations, and new ways of imagining what a human life should be. The age of great circular enclosures gave way to other forms of living. Across the wider region, communities became more settled. Houses grew more important. Rectangular architecture spread. Food production intensified. Plants that had once been gathered wild became increasingly managed, selected, cultivated, and changed by human hands. Animals that had once been hunted began, slowly and unevenly, to enter new relationships with people. The landscape of movement began to tighten into a landscape of return. This transition was not simple progress. It was not a clean march from hardship to comfort. Farming brought new power, but also new burdens. Fields required labor. Crops could fail. Stored food attracted pests, raiders, and social tension. Settled life brought people into closer contact with waste, disease, and one another. Ownership became more complicated. Inheritance mattered more. Boundaries hardened. Work intensified. The human body itself changed under new diets and new patterns of strain. Yet farming also allowed communities to remain in place with new commitment. It supported larger populations. It made storage central. It gave the household a different weight. A planted field is a promise to return. A repaired house is a claim on place. A grave beneath or near a dwelling ties the living to the dead in a new way. Slowly, the world of seasonal gathering began to share space with a world of permanent attachment. This is the great transition, not a collapse, but an absorption. The sacred energy that once gathered people around monumental enclosures did not vanish. It changed vessel. It moved into houses, into village plans, into ancestor practices, into stored grain, into the memory of particular lineages, into new ceremonies of fertility, land, and household continuity. The sacred did not disappear as people settled. It became more intimate, more local, more woven into the architecture of daily life. A circular enclosure on a hill gathers many groups into one dramatic space. A house gathers a family around its own fire. These are different social worlds. In the older ceremonial architecture, attention may have been focused on collective beings, animal powers, and monumental presences that exceeded any one household. In the emerging village world, attention increasingly turned toward domestic continuity, food storage, kinship, ancestry, and the repeated occupation of built rooms. The center of gravity shifted from the great gathering to the enduring home. This shift may help explain why the monumental tradition changed. If people increasingly lived in fixed settlements, they may no longer have needed the same kind of seasonal aggregation around distant ritual centers. If social identity became anchored in households and village communities, the role of massive shared enclosures may have diminished. If farming demanded continuous labor near fields, the old rhythms of long-distance gathering may have become harder to maintain. A society tied to crops cannot move with the same freedom as a society tied to wild herds. The field is a chain made of roots. It feeds, but it binds. As cultivated life expanded, new tensions would have appeared. Who controls the best land? Who stores the grain? Who decides when seed is planted? Who protects the harvest? Who inherits the house? Who marries into which lineage? Who has rights to water? These questions create forms of authority different from those needed to organize a hunt or raise a pillar. Leadership becomes more durable when resources stay in one place. The old world of temporary prestige may have hardened. A generous feast organizer could become a lineage head. A ritual specialist could become a permanent authority. A respected elder could become the guardian of land and memory. A household with stored food could influence those without it. The seeds of inequality do not always arrive as violence. Sometimes they arrive as responsibility, then become privilege. This was not yet the world of kings, armies, palaces, and writing, but the foundations were shifting. Sedentism, cultivation, storage, inheritance, and growing population created new social possibilities. The communal labor that once raised pillars could one day dig irrigation channels, build walls, harvest fields, and serve rulers. The sacred gathering that once united groups under stone beings could one day become temple institutions supported by agricultural surplus. Here lies one of the long roads of human history, from open ritual centers to village shrines, from village shrines to temples, from temples to temple estates, from temple estates to cities, From cities to states, the line is not straight, and Göbekli Tepe is not a simple beginning of everything. But the hill stands close to the threshold where human societies began developing patterns that would later reshape the earth. Fixed places, shared labor, food intensification, symbolic authority, memory attached to architecture, communities larger than ordinary kin groups, sacred centers that organized social life. The transformation also altered human relationships with animals. The carved creatures of Göbekli Tepe belong to a wild world. Foxes, serpents, boars, birds, wild cattle, and gazelle dominate the imagery. These are not obedient animals. They are not property in the later pastoral sense. They are powers encountered outside human control. They belong to the hunt, the dangerous thicket, the open plain, the carcass, the night. As domestication advanced, animals entered human society differently. Sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, and dogs became part of controlled life, though never completely controlled in spirit or behavior. Herding changes how people think. An animal becomes wealth, food, companion, sacrifice, inheritance, and responsibility. The old awe of the wild does not vanish, but it is joined by new ideas of possession, breeding, enclosure, and management. The Neolithic transition therefore changed not only economy, but imagination. A hunter asks where the herd has gone. A herder asks how the flock will be kept. A gatherer asks where the grain ripens. A farmer asks when the field must be sown. The questions reshape time itself. Farming binds people to future cycles with new intensity. Seed must be saved for a harvest that does not yet exist. Fields must be prepared before reward appears. Storage must protect tomorrow's hunger. Children inherit not only stories, but land, houses, and obligations. Time becomes layered through investment. The future is planted in the ground. At Göbekli Tepe, the great stones may belong to a moment when this new future was still uncertain. The builders were not yet fully trapped by fields, yet they were no longer untouched by the pull of permanence. Their monuments stand at the threshold between mobility and rootedness. They reveal people experimenting with how to remain connected across distance, how to anchor memory, how to gather labor, how to make place matter. In the centuries that followed, the logic of place would grow stronger. But something may have been lost. Mobile life offers flexibility, broad knowledge of landscapes, and social forms that can resist permanent hierarchy. Settled life offers stability, accumulation, and density, but it can also produce inequality, conflict, and dependence. The transition into farming was not only an ascent, it was a trade, made gradually, without anyone seeing the full price. Perhaps the builders of the great enclosures still lived close enough to the older freedom to carve the wild with such intensity. Later, village life may have turned toward different concerns, not because imagination declined, but because life's pressures changed. A person watching over stored grain has different fears from a person following gazelle beneath the sky. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know whether the people who closed the older enclosures felt they were ending an age. We do not know whether younger generations understood the pillars as ancient, sacred, outdated, dangerous, or simply inherited. We do not know whether the shift toward settled life was celebrated, mourned, resisted, or accepted without any sense of rupture. Human beings rarely know when they are crossing into a new era. They live day by day. They repair a wall, They plant a patch of grain. They bury a relative. They return to a hill because their parents did. They stop returning because other duties call. Then, centuries later, the old world is gone. The transition from hunters to villagers was one of the most consequential changes in the human story, but it unfolded through ordinary acts: a basket of seeds, a repaired roof, a fenced animal, a stored harvest, a path worn deeper between house and field, a child born into a room that their parents also knew as children, a memory of wandering becoming a story rather than a way of life. Göbekli Tepe stands in that fragile passage. It is not merely a relic of what came before agriculture. It is part of the process by which human beings learn to gather, settle, and reshape the world. Its stones belong to a society still full of wild animals and open horizons, yet already capable of fixed monuments and inherited sacred places. It is both Old World and New World, joined in limestone, and in that joining lies its power. The hill reminds us that civilization did not begin as a sudden invention. It condensed slowly from ritual, hunger, climate, memory, labor, experiment, and longing. It rose from people who did not yet know they were becoming the ancestors of villagers, farmers, city builders, kings, scribes, and all who came after. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made, but the transition preserved at Göbekli Tepe already shows us that humanity's road was never simple. It was not a road from darkness into light. It was a road from one kind of brilliance into another, from the wide knowledge of hunters to the rooted ambitions of villagers, from the sacred hill to the settled house, from the wild animal carved in stone to the planted field waiting under the sun. What remains at Göbekli Tepe is silence, but it is not emptiness. It is the silence of stone after song, the silence of a hill that has swallowed the footsteps of generations, the silence of carved animals whose meanings have outlived their makers, but not their mystery. Across 12,000 years, the ridge has watched the world transform beyond recognition. The hunters who knew its first ceremonies vanished into ancestry. The early villagers of the region passed into deeper time. The first farmers spread their seeds across new lands. Towns rose, cities burned. Kings announced themselves as chosen by heaven. Empires marched under banners. Scribes pressed names into clay. Bronze gave way to iron. Temples were built, destroyed, rebuilt, forgotten. New gods came, old gods faded. Languages rose like flames and disappeared like smoke. The hill remained, not unchanged, for nothing in the world is unchanged, but enduring enough to carry a message without words. It tells us that the deep past is not a ladder beneath us. It is a vast continent behind us, full of minds, experiments, losses, and brilliance. The people who carved Göbekli Tepe were not childish ancestors waiting for history to begin. They were fully human, already living inside questions we still recognize. How should the living gather? What do the dead become? Which places must be remembered? What powers move through animals, weather, hunger, and night? How can a community make meaning last beyond a single life? Every civilization that followed offered its own answers. The Sumerians gave the gods houses of mud brick rising above the floodplain. The Egyptians built mountains of stone for kings who wished to join eternity. The builders of Stonehenge aligned earth and sky in circles of memory. The Maya raised temples in green forests. The Greeks set columns beneath bright Mediterranean light. The great religions of later ages filled the world with sanctuaries, pilgrimage roads, chants, scriptures, icons, bells, lamps, and sacred thresholds. Yet the impulse is older than any of them, older than writing, older than monarchy, older than the plough. At Göbekli Tepe, that impulse stands near one of its earliest known monumental expressions. A community gathered before the settled world had fully hardened around fields and houses. They cut limestone from the ridge. They raised pillars. They carved animals of fear, cunning, death, and force. They created spaces that drew attention inward towards central beings whose faceless forms still unsettled the modern imagination, and then they buried them. That final act gives the site its strange dignity. Göbekli Tepe was not merely left to decay, it was folded back into the earth. The hidden stones waded through all the centuries that humans spent inventing civilization again and again, each time believing themselves nearer to certainty than those who came before. But certainty is fragile. The more we learn about the ancient world, the less simple the human story becomes. Agriculture did not automatically create ritual. Cities did not invent imagination. Kings did not invent authority. Writing did not invent memory. The state did not invent cooperation. Göbekli Tepe forces us to see that many of civilization's deepest foundations were laid in societies that possessed none of the later signs by which we usually recognize power. There was no palace on the hill, no throne, no army, no tax ledger, no carved royal name claiming the work. Yet there was organization, there was symbolism, there was labor at scale, there was technical knowledge, there was sacred geography, there was the ability to draw many people into a common project and leave behind something immense enough to trouble every generation that rediscovers it. This may be the greatest legacy of the site. It returns dignity to the people before the city. It restores complexity to those too often described only by what they lacked. No metal, no writing, no pottery in the earliest phases, no domesticated work animals, no visible kings. But this language of absence is misleading. They had memory, they had skill, they had myth, they had social bonds, they had ecological knowledge, they had stone tools sharp enough for their world and minds sharp enough for ours. They had the courage to make the invisible visible. When we stand before the pillars, even in imagination, we stand before a human act that refuses to become small. The stones are not impressive only because they are old. Age alone does not create wonder. They are impressive because they reveal a scale of thought we were not prepared to find so early. They tell us that people at the dawn of settled life were already building for ideas, not merely for shelter. That truth changes the way we see ourselves. Modern humanity often believes it lives at the summit of intelligence, looking down on the long climb of simpler minds, but the deep past does not support such arrogance. It shows us people adapting to climate upheaval, mastering landscapes, reading animals, shaping stone, organizing labor, feeding crowds, burying architecture, and creating symbolic worlds that still defeat easy explanation. They were not us in costume. They were not primitive versions of us. They were themselves, and because they were themselves, we owe them the respect of uncertainty. To force Göbekli Tepe into one clean answer would be to diminish it. A temple, a settlement, a pilgrimage center, a mortuary place, a feasting ground, a gathering node, a mythic landscape. Perhaps it was some of these, Perhaps it was all of these at different times. Perhaps it belonged to a category of human place that has no surviving name. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. No amount of longing can restore the first spoken myths. No excavation can return the exact sound of voices in the enclosure. No laboratory analysis can tell us what a child felt, seeing a carved serpent in firelight. No radiocarbon date can tell us whether the builders feared their stone beings or loved them. Science gives us the frame, the sequence, the material truth. It is indispensable. But the interior life of the people remains partly beyond recovery. That limit is not failure. It is part of the beauty of the past. The unknown keeps the dead from becoming possessions of the present. It reminds us that they lived full lives not designed for our understanding. They owed us no explanation. They built for their own world, not ours. We are latecomers at the edge of their silence, brushing dust from stones and trying to listen. And perhaps listening is enough. Göbekli Tepe asks us to listen to stone, soil, bone, and absence. It asks us to listen to the possibility that civilization began not only in hunger, but in wonder. It asks us to consider that, before the first city wall, human beings were already building thresholds between the seen and unseen. It asks us to imagine a world where gods and mortals once walked the earth, not because we can prove the gods were there, but because the people who raised the stones seem to have lived in a world where the sacred walked close. The hill also speaks to our own age. We live amid towers, networks, machines, satellites, and cities so vast they would have been unimaginable to the builders of the first enclosures. Yet we still gather. We still mark certain places as special. We still build monuments for the dead. We still tell origin stories. We still create symbols to hold communities together. We still fear that memory will vanish unless we give it form. The distance between us and Göbekli Tepe is immense. The connection is intimate. A hand carved a fox into limestone 12,000 years ago, and another human hand today traces the shape with the eye. A community raised a pillar before writing existed, and modern scholars measure it with instruments born of science. The ancient builders are gone, but the act remains legible enough to move us. Across the abyss of time, intention survives. That is why Göbekli Tepe matters, not because it gives us all the answers, but because it restores the depth of the question. Who are we, that so early in our story we raised stones not for defense, not for kings, not for commerce, but for meaning? What kind of creature does this? What kind of creature spends its strength on symbols, feeds the living under the gaze of the unseen, buries its sacred places, and leaves the future to wonder? The answer is simple and unfathomable. We do. Human beings do. From the limestone hills of southeastern Anatolia to the great cities of the present, the line is broken, tangled, and filled with loss. But it is still our line. We are the descendants of those who made tools, followed herds, gathered grain, mourned the dead, feared the night, watched the stars, and carved their questions into stone. Göbekli Tepe does not tell us where the road ends. It tells us how deep the road goes. And as the evening wind moves across the ridge, as the carved animals keep their silence, as the faceless pillars stand in the imagination like watchers at the edge of history, we are left with humility. The first temple before civilization may never fully surrender its meaning. Perhaps it should not. Some mysteries are not doors waiting to be opened, but horizons inviting us onward. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. Until then, the hill remains a mound of memory, a buried constellation, a threshold at the beginning of the human story. And in its silence, Göbekli Tepe reminds us that before civilization built its towers, before kings wrote their names into history, before the first cities rose on the plains, human beings were already standing beneath the stars, gathering around sacred stones, and asking the oldest question of all, "Why are we here?" End of script. Good night.